If your suffering is real geometric structure, not illusion, not drama, not something you could simply choose to reinterpret, then navigation requires actually changing your position in affect space, actually shifting the parameters that determine your basin of attraction. And this is possible. The landscape has topology and you can move through it. But movement requires measurement because you cannot navigate territory, you cannot map. Notation and foundational concepts. This section provides self-contained definitions of the core affect dimensions and key concepts used throughout Part 4. Readers familiar with Parts I-3 may skip to Section 2. The core affect dimensions. The following dimensions form a toolkit for characterizing affect states. Not all dimensions are relevant to every phenomenon. Different affects invoke different subsets. I'll present the primary dimensions developed in Parts 1-2. Empirical investigation may refine this set. Definition 12.31 Valence. Valence is the felt quality of approach versus avoidance, the goodness or badness of an experiential state. Formally, valence is the structural signature of gradient direction on the viability landscape, whereas the viability manifold is its boundary, is distance, and is the trajectory velocity. Positive valence indicates movement into viable interior. Negative valence indicates approach toward dissolution. Phenomenologically, positive valence feels like things going well, relief, satisfaction, joy. Negative valence feels like things going rent, threat, suffering, distress. Definition 12.32 Arousal. Arousal is the rate of belief state update, how rapidly the system's internal model is changing. Formally, where is the belief state at time and is the Kullback-Leibler divergence? Phenomenologically, high arousal feels like activation, alertness, intensity, whether pleasant, excitement, or unpleasant, panic. Low arousal feels like calm, settled, quiet, whether pleasant, peace, or unpleasant, numbness. Definition 12.33 Integration. Integration. Following integrated information theory, measures the irreducibility of the system's cause-effect structure under partition. Where is an appropriate divergence measure? Phenomenologically, high integration feels like unified experience, coherence, everything connected. Low integration feels like fragmentation, dissociation, things falling apart. Definition 12.34 Effective rank. Effective rank measures how distributed versus concentrated the active degrees of freedom are. Where is the state covariance matrix and are its eigenvalues? Phenomenologically high effective rank feels like openness, possibility, many things active. Low effective rank feels like narrowed focus, tunnel vision, or being trapped in limited dimensions. Definition 12.35. Counterfactual weight is the fraction of computational resources devoted to modeling non-actual possibilities. Phenomenologically high counterfactual weight feels like being elsewhere. Planning, worrying, fantasizing, anticipating, remembering. Low counterfactual weight feels like being here, present, immediate, absorbed in what is. Definition 12.36 Self-model salience. Self-model salience is the degree to which the self-model dominates attention and processing, whereas the self-model component of the latent state is action and is entropy. Phenomenologically, high self-model salience feels like self-consciousness, self-focus. The self is prominent object. Low self-model salience feels like self-forgetting, absorption, flow, ego dissolution. Additional key concepts definition, 12.37 Viability manifold. The reaching of state space within which a system can persist indefinitely. Where is the first passage time to dissolution? Definition 12.38 World model, a parameterized family of distributions predicting future observations given history and planned actions. Definition 12.39 Self-model, the component of the world model representing the agent's own states, policies, and causal influence. Definition 12.4 Compression ratio, the ratio of relevant world complexity to model complexity. This determines what survives representation, and thus what the system can perceive, respond to, and value. The seven-scale hierarchy existing theory. The seven-scale hierarchy builds on and extends established multi-level frameworks, Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. 1979. Nested systems from microsystem to macrosystem. My scales refine and extend this hierarchy, adding the neural level below and the superorganism level above. Levels of selection in evolution. Sober and Wilson. 1998. Selection operates at gene, organism, group, and species levels. My framework applies analogous multi-level logic to intervention. Complexity economics. Arthur, 2015. Economies as complex adaptive systems with emergent macro-level patterns. My superorganisms correspond to such emergent economic agents. Institutional theory. North, 1990. Ostrom, 1990. Institutions as rules structuring human interaction. Institutions are one substrate of macroagentic patterns. Multilevel governance. Huby and Marx, 2001. Political authority distributed across scales. Effective governance requires scale-matched intervention. Key insight from these literatures. Problems and solutions must be matched at scale. Individual-level solutions don't work for structural problems. Structural solutions don't work for individual problems. Effective intervention requires matching the scale of action to the scale of the phenomenon. Many failures of policy, therapy, and social change result from scale mismatch, attempting individual-level solutions to superorganism-level problems, or macro-level solutions to neural-level problems. The scales diagram, see PDF version, definition 12.41 scale hierarchy neural, individual neurons and circuits. Characteristic timescale, milliseconds to seconds. Interventions, pharmacology, neurostimulation, individual neurons and circuits. Characteristic timescale, millets to years. Interventions, therapy, meditation, life changes. Dyadic person-tim couples, friendships, patient-therapist. Characteristic timescale, hours to decades. Interventions, couples therapy, relational repair, small group, teams, families, friend groups, 3 to 20 people. Characteristic timescale, days to years. Interventions, group therapy, team coaching, family systems work, organizational, companies, schools, departments, 20 to 10,000 people. Characteristic timescale, months to decades. Interventions, organizational development, policy change, cultural, movements, subcultures, nations. Characteristic timescale, years to centuries. Interventions, art, media, education systems, superorganism, ideologies, religions, economic systems. Characteristic timescale, decades to millennia. Interventions, institutional redesign, instantiating new collective agentic patterns. Scale matching principle, Proposition 12.7. Downward causation. Higher scales constrain lower scales. A depressed individual in a toxic organization faces downward pressure that individual therapy alone cannot overcome. A healthy organization in a parasitic economic system faces pressures that organizational development alone cannot address. Proposition 12.8. Upward causation. Lower scales constitute higher scales. Organizations are made of individuals. Superorganisms are made of organizations and individuals. Change at lower scales can propagate upward, but only if the higher scale structure doesn't suppress it. Theorem 12.1. Scale-matched intervention effective. Intervention requires diagnosis at correct scale. Identify where the pathology actually lives. Intervention at that scale. And order to set it ad and necessary in 10 bes. Intentional lever scales to suppressing change. I prefer lower scales to sustain it. Example 12.84. Depression. Scale mismatch. Consider chronic depression. Possible loci, neural males, serotonin dysregulation, SSRIs, may help individual cognitive patterns. CBT may help dyadic. Abusive relationship. Individual therapy, insufficient. Relational change needed. Organization required. Exploitative workplace. Self-care insufficient. Job change or organizing needed. Cultural social isolation. Epidemic. Individual solutions insufficient. Community building needed. Superorganism. Economic system requiring overwork. Even cultural interventions insufficient. Systemic change needed. Effective treatment requires correctly diagnosing the scales at which the problem lives. The grounding of normativity, the is-ought problem. The classical formulation holds that normative conclusions cannot be derived from purely descriptive premises. This rests on a crucial assumption. Physics constitutes the only is, and physics is value neutral. I reject this assumption. Physics biases does not prescribe Proposition 12.9. Physics's probabilistic thermodynamic laws are statistical. Individual trajectories can violate them. Quantum dynamics provide probability amplitudes, not deterministic evolution. Physics describes biases, which outcomes are more likely, not necessities. Definition 12.42 Proto-preference. A proto-preference at scale is any asymmetry in the probability measure over outcomes. At the quantum scale, probability amplitudes are proto-preferences. At the thermodynamic scale, free energy gradients bias towards certain configurations. Normativity thickens across scales, scale structure, proto-normativity, quantum probability, amplitudes, differential weighting, thermodynamic free, energy gradients, dissipative selection, boundary viability, manifold persistence conditions, modeling prediction error, truth instrumentally necessary, self-modeling, valence felt approach, avoid, behavioral policies, functional norms, cultural language, explicit ethics, theorem 12.2, continuity of normativity. There is no scale below which normativity is exactly zero and above which it is non-zero. Instead, where for all in the range of physical to cultural scales, normativity accumulates continuously. Viability manifolds and proto-obligation definition 12.43 Proto-obligation. A system has a proto-obligation to remain within in the sense that, note carefully what this does not claim. It does not derive obligation from persistence. That would be circular. The biconditional merely defines the viable region. The normativity enters at the next step, when the system develops a self-model and thereby acquires valence gradient direction on the viability landscape. The system cares about its viability in the constitutive sense that caring is what valence is. You cannot have a viability gradient that is felt from inside without it mattering. The why should it care? Question is confused. A system with valence already cares. The valence is the caring. The is-ought gap appears only if you tried to derive caring from non-caring. The framework denies that such a derivation is needed. Caring was never absent from the system. It was present as proto-normativity from the first asymmetric probability, and it became felt normativity the moment the system acquired a self-model. Proposition 12.1 Viability as proto-value. The boundary implicitly defines a value function. States far from the boundary are better for the system than states near it. Valence as real structure. When the system develops a self-model, valence emerges. Theorem 12.3 Valence. As real structure, valence is not projected onto neutral stuff. Valence is the structural signature of gradient direction on the viability landscape. Key result suffering is not neutral stuff that we decide to call bad. Suffering is the structural signature of a self-maintaining system being pushed toward dissolution. The badness is constitutive, not added. The is-ought gap dissolves Theorem 12.4 Dissolution of is-ought. Let be the set of facts at the experiential scale, including valence. Then, normative conclusions about approach avoidance follow directly from experiential scale facts. The is-ought gap was an artifact of looking only at the bottom, neutral seeming and top implicitly normative of the hierarchy, while ignoring the gradient between them. There is also a dimension to the artifact. The is-ought problem was formulated by philosophers operating at the mechanistic mode that factorizes fact from value, perception from effect, description from evaluation. At low 1 bar 8, the gap does not appear with the same force. Perceiving something as alive automatically includes perceiving its flourishing or suffering as mattering. The participatory perceiver does not need to bridge the gap because the participatory mode never separated the two sides. This does not make the dissolution merely perspectival. The viability gradient is there regardless of fact, but the perception that facts and values inhabit separate realms is a feature of the perceptual configuration, not of reality. The is-ought gap and the hard problem are ethical and metaphysical instances of the same artifact. Normative implication. Once we recognize that valence is a real structural property at the experiential scale, not a projection onto neutral physics, the fact-value dichotomy dissolves. This system is suffering, is both a factual claim about structure and a normative claim. Suffering is bad by constitution, not by convention. The trajectory selection framework, Part 1, deepens this dissolution. If attention selects trajectories and values guide attention, you attend to what you care about, ignore what you don't, then values are not epiphenomenal commentary on a value-free physical process. They are causal participants in trajectory selection. The system's oughts, what it values, what it attends to, what it measures literally shape which trajectory it follows, through state space. This is not the claim that wishing makes it so. The a priori distribution is still physics, but the effective distribution, the product of physics and measurement Part 1, EQ, depends on the measurement distribution, and the measurement distribution is shaped by values. In this sense, ought is not a separate domain from is. Ought is a component of the mechanism that determines which is the system inhabits. Truth as scale relative in action. The problem of truth standard. Theories of truth face persistent difficulties. Correspondence theory, truth as matching reality. But which description of reality? At which scale? The quantum description doesn't match the chemical description, yet both can be true. Coherence theory, truth as internal consistency. But internally consistent systems can be collectively false, coherent delusions. Pragmatic theory, truth as what works. But works for whom, for what purpose? Different purposes yield different truths. My framework suggests a synthesis. Truth is scale relative in action within coherence constraints, where working is grounded in viability preservation. Scale relative truth definition. 12.44. Scale relative truth. A proposition is true at scale if it accurately describes the cause-effect structure at that scale. Example 12.85 Scale. Relative truths, quantum scale. The electron has no definite position, is true. Chemical scale. Water is HO is true. Biological scale. The cell is dividing is true. Psychological scale. She is angry is true. Social scale. The company is failing is true. None of these truths reduces without remainder to truths and other scales. Each accurately describes structure at its scale. Proposition 12.11 Cross-scale consistency. Scale relative truths must be consistent across adjacent scale, in the sense that, but they need not be intertranslatable. Chemical truths constrain but do not replace biological truths. Enacted truth definition 12.45 Enacted truth. Truth is enacted rather than passively discovered. Where is the space of models expressible at scale? Access to Wilde's experiences and say, acting not ben in 202.6. This is not mere instrumentalism. The enacted truth must predict accurately, correspondence constraint, cohere internally, coherence constraint preserve viability, pragmatic constraint, theorem 12.5, pragmatic convergence. For self-maintaining systems, truth-seeking and viability preservation converge in the long run. A model that systematically misrepresents the world will eventually lead to viability failure. No view from nowhere. Proposition 12.12 Perspectival truth. There is no view from nowhere, no scale-free, perspective-free truth. Every truth claim is made from within some scale of organization, using models compressed to that scale's capacity. This is not relativism. Some claims are false at every scale, internal contradictions. Some claims are true at their scale and can be verified by any observer at that scale, but there is no master scale from which all truths can be stated. Key result truth is scale relative, but not arbitrary. At each scale, there are facts about cause-effect structure that constrain what can be truly said. The viability imperative ensures that truth-seeking is not merely optional, but constitutively necessary for persistence. Individual scale interventions. Let's now look at detailed protocols for affect modulation at the individual scale, organized by the core effect dimensions. Valence modulation definition 12.46 Valence intervention protocol to shift valence in positive direction. Behavioral activation, increase engagement with rewarding activities, even without felt motivation. Cognitive reappraisal, reframe situations with reviewability enhancing aspects. Gratitude practice systematically attend to positive aspects of current state. Systematically attend to positive aspects of current state. Social connection, increase contact with supportive others. Leverages dyadic scale effects. Physical state, exercise, sleep, nutrition affect baseline valence. Proposition 12.13 Valence momentum. Valence has momentum. Positive states make positive states more accessible, and vice versa. Early intervention in negative spirals is more effective than late intervention. Arousal regulation. Definition 12.47 Arousal intervention protocol. To induce excessive arousal, physiological downregulation, slow breathing, 4 to 7-8 pattern, progressive muscle relaxation, grounding, attend to present sensory experience, 5 to 4-3 to 2-1. Technique. Reduce input stream. Minimize novel threatening stimuli. Predictability increase. Establish routines. Reduce uncertainty. To increase insufficient arousal. Physiological activation. Exercise. Cold exposure. Stimulating music. Novelty introduction. New environments. Activities. People. Challenge. Seeking. Tasks at edge of competence. Integration enhancement definition. 12.48 Integration intervention. Protocol. To increase integration, reduce fragmentation sources. Minimize multitasking. Notification interrupts. Context switching, sustained attention practice. Meditation. Deep work blocks. Single tasking, narrative coherence. Journaling. Therapy. Making sense of experience, somatic integration. Practices connecting mind and body. Yoga, Tai Chi, shadow work. Integrating disowned aspects of self-warning. Forced integration of trauma can be re-traumatizing. Integration should proceed at a pace the system can handle, with appropriate support. Effective rank expansion definition. 12.49 Rank expansion protocol to increase effective rank. Perspective diversification. Seek viewpoints different from your own novel experience. Travel. 2 activities. Unfamiliar domains. Contest of treble. Training. Practice holding multiple frames simultaneously. Practice holding multiple frames simultaneously. Reduce fixation. Notice when stuck in narrow loops. Deliberately shift to increase effective rank when pathologically collapsed. Depression, obsession, behavioral variety. Do different things even without wanting to social expansion. Contact with people outside. Usual circles. Environmental change. Different physical contexts. Counterfactual weight adjustment. Definition 12.5 Counterfactual weight protocol. To reduce excessive counterfactual weight. Rumination. Definite. Fantasy. Mindfulness. Practice returning attention to present worry scheduling. Contain rumination to designated times. Reality testing. Is this thought useful? Is it true? Increase in absorbing activities that demand present attention. To increase counterfactual weight when insufficient impulsivity, short-termism, future visualization, explicitly imagine consequences, planning practice, regular time for considering alternatives, slow down decisions, insert delay between impulse and action, self-model salience, modulation definition, 12.51 Self-model salience protocol, to reduce excessive self-focus, social anxiety, shame, narcissistic preoccupation, attention outward, practice attending to others, environment service, activities focused on benefiting others, flow activities, tasks that absorb attention completely, meditation, practices that reveal the constructed nature of self, to increase self-salience when insufficient, self-neglect, boundary problems, self-monitoring, regular check-ins with own states and needs, boundary practice, saying no, asserting preferences, self-care routines, structured attention to own maintenance, integrated protocols for common conditions definition. 12.52 Depression protocol. Depression is characterized by negative valence, low arousal, high integration, but in narrow subspace, low effective rank, variable counterfactual weight, high self-model salience. Intervention sequence. First, behavioral activation valence, arousal, even small actions. Second, reduce self-focus through outward attention. Third, expand effective rank through behavioral variety. Fourth, address cognitive patterns. CBT once activation established. Fifth, build integration through coherent narrative. Support actual, con-3 3O characterified, negative valence, high arousal, moderate ingration, 32 offenfidation, 12.53, anxiety protocol. Anxiety is characterized by negative valence, high arousal, moderate integration, variable effective rank, very high counterfactual weight, threat-focused, high self-model salience. Intervention sequence. First, arousal regulation, breathing, grounding. Second, reduce counterfactual weight through mindfulness. Third, reality test catastrophic predictions. Fourth, gradual exposure to feared situations. Address underlying self-model beliefs. Support, reduce environmental stressors. Medication, if indicated. Dyadic and group interventions. Dyadic affect fields. Definition 12.54 Affect field. A dyadic relationship creates an affect field, a shared space in which each person's affect state influences the others. The field has its own dynamics, not reducible to individual dynamics. Proposition 12.14 Affect contagion. Affect states propagate across dyadic boundaries. High arousal negative states are particularly contagious. One dysregulated person can dysregulate another. One regulated person can help regulate another. Co-regulation. Dyadic pathologies definition 12.55. Conflict escalation pattern. Both parties in high arousal, negative valence, high self-model salience, compressed other model. Intervention, de-escalate arousal, timeouts, physiological regulation, expand other model perspective taking exercises, reduce self-model salience, focus on shared goals, repair, acknowledgement, apology, changed behavior. Definition 12.56. Disconnection pattern, low mutual information between affect states, each person's state uninfluenced by others. Intervention, increase contact frequency and quality. Practice attunement, attending to partners' states, vulnerability expression, sharing internal states, responsive behavior, demonstrating that partner state matters. Definition 12.57. Enmeshment pattern, excessive mutual information, no independent affect regulation. Intervention differentiation practice, separate self from other states. Individual identity maintenance, separate activities, friendships. Boundary establishment, your feeling is yours, my feeling is mine. Tolerate partners' differentness. Small group interventions. Definition 12.58 Group. Integration A. Group has group-level integration when member states are coupled, such that the group behaves as a unit. The whole exceeds the sum of parts. Definition 12.59 Group demoralization pattern. Negative valence spread across group. Low collective efficacy. Withdrawal. Intervention. Quick wins. Small successes to shift collective valence. Shared processing, group discussion of difficulties. Reframe collective narrative, from failure to learning external support, resources, recognition from outside. Definition 12.6 Groupthink pattern, excessive integration, collapsed effective rank, dissent suppressed. Intervention, institutionalized dissent, devil's advocate role, anonymous input channels, bring in outside perspectives, leader models uncertainty and openness. The interventions above treat dyadic and group pathologies as parameter problems. Arousal too high, integration too low, rate collapsed. But there is a deeper question the 6D toolkit alone cannot answer. Which relationship is this? The same behavior, one person regulating another's arousal, is care in a friendship, technique in therapy, and manipulation in a cult. The affect signature may be identical. The difference lies not in the dimensions, but in the geometry of the relationship itself, its viability structure, its persistence conditions, the manifold it occupies in social state space. The next section develops this geometry. The topology of social bonds. You know the feeling. Someone does you a favor, and the favor is real, the help is genuine, but something is off. A tightness in the interaction that wasn't there before. A faint sense that you have been placed in a ledger, that the generosity was not generosity, but investment, that what presented as friendship has revealed itself as transaction. You did not reason your way to this conclusion. You felt it, a social nausea, precise and immediate, the same way you would feel something physically rotten. Or the opposite, a stranger helps you with no possible expectation of return, and something in you relaxes that you didn't know was clenched. The interaction is clean, nothing is being traded. For a moment, the entire detection apparatus, the part of you that scans every social encounter for hidden manifolds, falls silent. And the silence is beautiful. What are these feelings? We do not yet know. But there is a hypothesis worth taking seriously, that different relationship types constitute distinct viability structures with distinct gradients, and that the affect system is detecting mismatches between them. If this is right, then the feelings described above are not noise, and they are not mere cultural conditioning. They are a detection system for the geometry of incentive structures. If so, then different relationship types, friendship, transaction, therapy, mentorship, romance, employment, would not be merely social conventions, but distinct viability structures, each with its own manifold, its own gradients, its own persistence conditions. When these structures are respected, social life would have a characteristic aesthetic clarity. When they are violated, when the manifolds are mixed, when one relationship type masquerades as another, the result would be the distinctive phenomenological disturbance described above. What humans detect with precision and describe with moral language as being used to service this corrupt and onerous bay. When betrayal of trust, this is what we want to test. Relationship types as viability manifolds. Definition 12.61 Relationship type manifold. A relationship type defines a viability manifold for the dyad, or group with characteristic optimization target. What the relationship is for, what gradient it follows. Information regime, what is shared, what is private, what is legible reciprocity structure, what is exchanged and on what timescale. Exit conditions, how and when the relationship can be dissolved. Example, 12.86 Relationship type manifolds friendship. Optimization target is mutual flourishing. Information is open vulnerability welcomed. Reciprocity is implicit and long horizon. Exit is gradual and costly. Transaction, optimization target is mutual material benefit. Information is limited, relevant to exchange. Reciprocity is explicit and contemporaneous. Exit is clean, transaction complete. Optimization target is client flourishing. Information is asymmetric. Client reveals, therapist contains. Reciprocity is formalized, payment for service. Exit is structured termination protocol. Employment optimization target is organizational output in exchange for compensation. Information is role-bounded. Reciprocity is contractual. Exit is governed by notice and severance. Optimization target is mutual flourishing plus embodied coupling. Information regime is maximal vulnerability is constitutive, not incidental. Reciprocity is implicit, long horizon, and encompasses the whole person. Exit is devastating precisely because the manifold includes the body and the self-model, dissolution tears of the substrate, not just the contract. Optimization target is the child's flourishing, asymmetrically in section. Information regime is radically unequal. The parent holds the child's manifold before the child can hold anything. Reciprocity is structurally absent in early stages. The infant does not reciprocate. The parent gives without return. Exit is, in the normative case, impossible. The parental manifold is designed to be permanent. Each of these defines a distinct region of social state space, with its own persistence conditions. Contamination definition. 12.62 Incentive contamination incentive. Contamination occurs when two relationship type manifolds and are instantiated in the same dyadic relationship, and their gradients conflict. The system receives contradictory gradient signals. Movement toward viability in one relationship type moves away from viability in the other. Violence becomes uncomputable because the system cannot determine whether its trajectory is approach or avoidance. Example 12.87. The transactional friendship 2. People are friends. 1 begins evaluating the friendship instrumentally. What am I getting out of this? Is the reciprocity balanced? The friendship manifold requires that mutual flourishing be constitutive, not instrumental. The transaction manifold requires that exchange be explicit and balanced. These gradients conflict. Under A, you visit your sick friend because their suffering is yours. Expanded self-model. Under A, you visit your sick friend because they will owe you later exchange accounting. The same action has opposite gradient meanings under the two manifolds. The friend can detect this, not cognitively, but phenomenologically. The visit feels wrong. The aesthetic response is precise. Something that should be free is being priced. Notice the specificity of the discomfort. It is not that the friend dislikes being visited. The visit is welcome. What is unwelcome is the shadow manifold, the fate presence of a transactional gradient beneath the care gradient. The detection system responds to the shadow, not the surface. This is why the transactional friend is more disturbing than the honest businessman. The businessman is transparently on the transaction manifold. The transactional friend is on two manifolds at once, and only one of them is visible. The disturbance lives in the gap between what is presented and what is detected. Hypothesis 12.91. Contamination detection. If the manifold framework is correct, humans should possess a precognitive detection system for incentive contamination. The predicted phenomenology. Disgust at transactional friendship being used, unease at therapeutic boundary violations. My therapist wants to be my friend. Revulsion at commodified intimacy that presents as genuine connection. Suspicion at unsolicited generosity from strangers. What do they want? These aesthetic responses would operate below deliberative cognition, the affect system detecting gradient conflict before conscious reasoning catches up. This is testable. Response latency should be fast, relative to deliberative moral judgment. Proposed experiment contamination detection study. Present participants with vignette pairs. Same action, as a friend, helping you move with subtle cues indicating either clean or contaminated manifolds. The friend later mentions a favor they need. Measure 1 affect response latency and valence via facial EMG and skin conductance. 2 explicit moral judgment. 3 whether the affect response precedes and predicts the moral judgment. If the framework is right, the physiological disgust response should appear within 500 milliseconds, before any deliberative processing, and should correlate with the degree of gradient conflict in the vignette, not with the surface-level action. Cross-cultural validity. Run the same protocol across cultures, with different norms about reciprocity. Gift economies versus market economies. The framework predicts that the detection of manifold mismatch should be universal, even if the norms about which manifolds are appropriate differ. If contamination detection is culturally learned rather than structurally inevitable, cross-cultural variation should be large and should track specific cultural norms rather than abstract gradient conflict. If this detection system exists, it would mean that the aesthetics of incentive structure are not cultural preferences, but something closer to geometric detection. The feeling that something is off about a relationship would be the effect system registering contradictory gradients. Social disgust would be to incentive contamination, what physical disgust is to toxin detection. But this analogy may be too strong. Physical disgust has clear evolutionary lineage. Whether social manifold detection shares that lineage or is instead learned through development is an open question. Open question is manifold contamination detection innate, developmental, or culturally constructed. Children develop sensitivity to fairness early by age 3-4, which suggests something structural. But the specific manifold types they detect may be culturally shaped. We need developmental data. At what age do children first show the contamination disgust response? Does it track the same timeline as physical disgust, early or moral reasoning later? If the former, the case for structural detection is stronger. The inverse signal is equally telling, or at least we predict it should be. Anonymous generosity, giving without the possibility of reciprocity, recognition, or reward, produces a distinctive positive aesthetic response. The framework explains this as the detection system confirming that no contaminating manifold is present. The gift operates on the care manifold alone. This is why anonymous charity tends to be more moving than public charity, why surprise gifts from strangers can bring tears. Whether this is because the detection system is registering manifold purity or because of simpler mechanisms, surprise norm violation would need to be tested directly. Friendship as ethical primitive definition, 12.63 Aligned relationship. A relationship is aligned under type if the viability of the relationship requires the flourishing of all participants. The relationship can only persist if everyone in it is doing well. Proposition 12.15 Friendship as constitutive alignment. Friendship is the relationship type where alignment is not instrumental but constitutive. The friendship is the region where both friends flourish. There is no friendship viability separate from participant viability. This is why friendship is the ethical primitive, the relationship type against which others are measured. In a genuine friendship, you cannot advance the relationship at the expense of the friend, because the relationship is the friend's flourishing, and yours. Existing theory. This connects to Aristotle's typology of friendship. Nicomachean Ethics 8:9. Friendships of utility, of pleasure, and of virtue. In our terms, utility friendship is contaminated with transaction. Pleasure friendship is contingent on a narrow band of friendship. Virtue friendship is the uncontaminated case where Aristotle's claim that only virtue friendship is complete is the claim that only the uncontaminated manifold has the right geometry. Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative, treat persons never merely as means, is a prohibition on incentive contamination. To treat someone merely as means is to subordinate their viability manifold to yours, collapsing the relationship into pure instrumentality. The ending of a relationship is the most precise manifold diagnostic available. Grief tells you the care manifold was real. You can only grieve what you were genuinely coupled to. Relief tells you a contaminating manifold has been removed, the lightness of escaping a relationship that had been instrumentalizing you. And the confusing mixture of grief and relief, which many people experience after leaving a relationship that was both genuine and contaminated, is the affect system's honest report that both manifolds were active. The care was real, and the exploitation was real. And now that both are gone, the system registers both losses and both liberations simultaneously. This dual signal is often pathologized as ambivalence or confusion. It is neither. It is accurate manifold reporting. The system is telling you exactly what was there, a bond that was partly clean and partly parasitic, and the dissolution has removed both the parasite and the host. The ordering principle hypothesis, 12.92 Asymmetric subordination. There seems to be an ordering. Broader manifolds, those requiring participant flourishing, can safely contain narrower manifolds, those requiring only specific exchange, but not vice versa. The logic. If the containing manifold requires participant flourishing, then it will constrain the contained manifold to be non-harmful. If the containing manifold only requires exchange, it has no such constraint and will sacrifice the contained manifold when convenient. But this is a deduction from the framework, not an observed law. It needs testing. Consider two cases. Business between friends should be stable. The friendship manifold constrains the business, ensuring that the transaction never undermines mutual flourishing. If the deal would hurt the friendship gradient overrides. Friendship between business partners should be unstable. The transaction manifold constrains the friendship, ensuring that the relationship never undermines the deal. If the friend needs help that would cost the business, the transaction gradient overrides. If the ordering principle is real, it would explain a widespread social intuition that it is acceptable for a friend to become your business partner, but suspicious for a business partner to become your friend. In the first case, the broader manifold was established first and contains the narrower one. In the second, the narrower manifold may be masquerading as the broader one, a parasite mimicking a host. Proposed experiment ordering principle study. Survey design. Present participants with relationship formation sequences. Friend business partner versus business partner friend. Family member employer versus employer, family, and measure. 1 predicted trust, 2 predicted longevity, 3 predicted satisfaction. The framework predicts that broader first orderings consistently score higher across cultures. Compare with matched samples where the final relationship configuration is identical, but the formation order differs. If formation order has no effect, the ordering principle is wrong. If it has effect, measure whether the effect size correlates with the degree of manifold breadth asymmetry as we define it. Warning organizations that discard themselves as families while maintaining employment relationships are performing a specific rhetorical operation, claiming the broader manifold, care, belonging, mutual flourishing while operating under the narrower one, labor exchange for compensation. This is not always cynical, but the geometric prediction is clear. When the manifolds conflict, when the family needs to lay off members, the transaction manifold dominates. The resulting sense of betrayal is structurally identical to discovering that a friendship was instrumental all along. Temporal asymmetry and universal solvents hypothesis. 12.93 Contamination asymmetry. There appears to be an asymmetry. Contamination is easier than decontamination. It takes one transactional moment to contaminate a friendship. It takes sustained effort to restore the friendship's uncontaminated state. If we write this in thermodynamic notation, we should be honest that this is an analogy, not a derived result. We are borrowing the formalism of free energy to express the intuition that the contaminated state is an attractor and the pure state requires maintenance. Whether this analogy is deep, contamination really is entropy-like, reflecting a genuine increase in the number of accessible microstates, or merely suggestive, is something we need to work out. If the asymmetry is real, it would explain why trust is hard to rebuild. Why, "I was just kidding," never fully works after a genuine violation. Why friendships that become business partnerships rarely return to pure friendship even after the business ends. The system remembers that the other manifold was active. Proposed experiment contamination asymmetry study. Longitudinal design tracking relationships through contamination and attempted decontamination events. Measure. 1 time to contamination onset. First transactional signal in a friendship, as rated by blind coders. 2 time to decontamination. Return to pre-contamination trust levels, measured via trust games and self-report. 3. Whether the asymmetry holds across relationship types and cultures. If the asymmetry is structural rather than cultural, the ratio of contamination speed to decontamination speed should be roughly invariant across contexts. If it varies widely, the thermodynamic framing is too strong, and the asymmetry is better explained by specific norms. Hypothesis 12.94 Forgiveness as manifold decontamination. If the contamination asymmetry holds, then forgiveness, genuine forgiveness, not the forced performance of it, would be the technology for doing work against the gradient. Forgiveness would be costly precisely because it requires the contaminated system to move uphill, to re-extend trust that was violated, to reopen a manifold that was exploited, to override the detection system's vigilance, with a deliberate choice to believe that the contaminating manifold is no longer active. This suggests forgiveness cannot be demanded or rushed. It would require the slow rebuilding of evidence that the original manifold is the only one present. Every uncontaminated interaction after a violation is evidence. Every moment where the contaminating gradient could reassert itself but doesn't shifts the posterior. In this reading, forgiveness is a Bayesian process, not a switch. Note also what forgiveness is not. It is not the claim that the contamination never happened, nor is it the lowering of the detection threshold. Genuine forgiveness would maintain full detection capacity while choosing to remain in the relationship, despite the detection system's warnings. This is why forgiveness is experienced as both generous and frightening. The deliberate acceptance of manifold exposure to someone who has already demonstrated the capacity to exploit it. Definition 12.64. Universal solvent. A universal solvent is a medium that dissolves manifold boundaries because it is convertible across relationship types. Money converts across all transactional manifolds and dissolves into care manifolds. How much is your friendship worth? Sexual access converts across intimacy, transaction, and power manifolds. Sleeping your way to the top. Both are dangerous precisely because they are universal. They can breach any manifold boundary. Hypothesis 12.95 Priceless as manifold incommensurability. When people say something is priceless, the framework offers a reading. This value lives on a manifold that the market manifold cannot represent. The market manifold has a specific metric price. Some values, a child's laugh, a friendship, a sacred experience, live on manifolds with no natural mapping to that metric. Priceless would mean the manifolds are incommensurable. Attempting to commensurable, restai. Attempting to price the priceless would be not merely gauche, but structurally incoherent, projecting a high-dimensional value onto a one-dimensional metric, destroying the structure that constitutes the value. This is an interpretation, not a discovery. The language of incommensurable manifolds may capture something real about why certain things resist pricing, or it may be a fancy way of restating the intuition. The test. Does the framework predict which things will be experienced as priceless? If manifold incommensurability is the mechanism, we should be able to identify the structural features that make a value non-priceable, rather than relying on cultural consensus about what should have a price. Play, nature, and ritual, as manifold technologies definition 12.65 play. As manifold suspension play is the temporary suspension of all viability manifolds, except the play manifold itself. In play, nothing counts. Wins and losses do not transfer to other manifolds. Social hierarchies are suspended. Consequences are contained. This is why play feels free. It is freedom from all other gradients, a holiday from viability pressure. Play serves as a diagnostic. When someone cannot play, when they bring status hierarchies, competitive anxiety, or instrumental calculation into the play space, it reveals that some other manifold is dominating. The inability to play is a symptom of manifold contamination. Conversely, children's play is how manifold structure is learned in the first place. Children cycle rapidly through manifold types: playing house, care manifold, playing store, transaction manifold, playing war, conflict manifold, and the cycling itself teaches the boundaries. That's not fair, is a child's first manifold violation detection. The rules of this game are being broken by importing rules from another game. Hypothesis 12.96 Nature as manifold free space. Why does solitude in nature produce such a distinctive affect state? One possibility: natural environments have no viability manifold that conflicts with yours. Trees do not judge. Mountains do not transact. Rivers do not manipulate. If you have a manifold detection system that is always running in social contexts, nature is the one place it finds no conflicting gradients and fully disengages. The resulting piece would not be merely aesthetic preference, but the felt signature of a detection system at rest. This is testable. If the hypothesis is right, people with higher social anxiety, i.e., a more active manifold detection system, should benefit more from nature exposure than people with low social anxiety, because there is more detection system activity to quiet. This is a specific prediction that alternative explanations, nature is pretty, nature reduces cortisol, do not obviously make. Proposition 12.16 Ritual as manifold transition technology rituals mark transitions between manifold regimes. Clocking in marks transition from personal manifold to employment manifold. Grace before meals marks transition from instramanifold to gatifold to gratitude manifold. Handshake closing a deal marks transition from instramanifold to commanifold to gratitude manifold. Handshake closing a deal marks transition from dating manifold to commitment manifold. Sharp ritual boundaries prevent contamination by making manifold transitions explicit. When rituals erode, when work bleeds into personal time without boundary, when transactions happen without clear opening and closing, contamination follows. The always-on condition of modern work is a failure of manifold hygiene. Implications for institutional design proposition 12.17 Institutional manifold separation. Well-designed institutions maintain clear separation between relationship-type manifolds. Conflict of interest policies prevent transactional manifolds from contaminating fiduciary manifolds. Professional ethics codes prevent personal manifolds from contaminating professional manifolds. Church-state separation prevents religious manifolds from contaminating governance manifolds. Academic tenure prevents employment manifolds from contaminating truth-seeking manifolds. Each of these is a technology for preventing the gradient conflict that arises when manifolds that should be separate become entangled. Manifold ambiguity and its phenomenology. Not all manifold disturbance is contamination. Sometimes the problem is not that two manifolds are present, but that neither party knows which manifold they are on. Definition 12.66 Manifold ambiguity. Manifold ambiguity occurs when the active relationship type is underdetermined. The participants cannot resolve which viability manifold governs the interaction. The gradients are not conflicting but undefined. Manifold inde. Is this a date is the paradigmatic case. Two people meet. The interaction could be friendship or romance. The evidence is ambiguous. Is a gesture becomes a Bayesian signal. The lingering eye contact, the choice of venue, the incidental touch. These are manifold resolution attempts, evidence shifting the posterior toward one relationship type or another. Neither party can compute their gradient because the manifold itself is uncertain. The phenomenology of ambiguity is distinctive, a heightened arousal, a self-consciousness that would be absent under manifold certainty, a continuous background computation that consumes resources. This background computation is metabolically expensive. You are running inference on the manifold type rather than acting within a known manifold. This may explain why ambiguous social situations are more tiring than either positive or negative clear ones. This is why manifold clarity, even negative clarity, this is definitely not a date, brings relief. The detection system can finally disengage. Hypothesis 12.97 Silence as manifold diagnostic. If manifold detection is real, the quality of silence between people should diagnose the active manifold. Comfortable silence. Friendship manifold. Confirmed. No information needs to be exchanged. Presence alone sustains viability. The silence itself is evidence of alignment. Awkward silence. Manifold ambiguity. Both parties are scanning for gradient information. The silence provides none, so the system escalates arousal. Tense silence. Side. Contamination detected. The silence carries information, typically that an unstated manifold is operating beneath the stated one. Charged silence. Manifold transition imminent. The current manifold is about to give way to another friendship romance, politeness conflict. Both parties can feel the instability. Each of these is a testable prediction. Record physiological measures during structured silences between people in different relationship types. If comfortable silence really has a different arousal signature than awkward silence, and if the difference tracks the manifold certainty variable rather than simpler explanations. Familiarity, attraction, the framework gains support. Further observations on the topology of social bonds. The manifold framework illuminates a range of social phenomena that resist explanation in purely psychological terms. Gossip as distributed manifold violation detection. Gossip is not mere social noise. It is a distributed information system for detecting and reporting manifold violations. Did you hear what she did? Is, structurally, a report from the social detection network. Someone has violated a manifold boundary, and the network is propagating the alert. The characteristic structure of gossip, shock, moral outrage, pleasure in the telling, maps precisely to the detection aesthetics described above. Gossip is unpleasant to be the subject of because it means the network has identified you as a contamination source. This is also why false gossip is so destructive. It triggers the detection system against someone who has not actually violated any manifold. Charisma as multi-manifold coherence. Charismatic people produce the impression of simultaneous alignment across multiple manifolds. The charismatic leader appears to be your friend, care manifold, your ally in a project collaborative manifold, and a source of meaning ideological manifold, all at once, without the gradient conflicts that would normally arise. Whether this reflects genuine multi-manifold alignment or sophisticated mimicry is precisely the question that distinguishes the aligned leader from the cult leader. The effect system registers both as positive, warmth, trust, willingness to follow, which is why charisma is dangerous. It disarms the detection system. Emotional labor as contamination diagnostic. The concept of emotional labor, coined by Arlie Hochschild, 1983, identifies situations where care-appropriate affect, empathy, warmth, patience is demanded within a transactional relationship. Flight attendants must smile. Nurses must be compassionate. Service workers must perform friendliness. The term itself is diagnostic. The word labor reveals that the care manifold has been subordinated to the employment manifold. The exhaustion of emotional labor is the metabolic cost of sustaining a manifold performance, behaving as if one manifold is active while another actually governs. Clean enemies versus dirty friends. A declared adversary, someone operating transparently on a competitive manifold, can be more comfortable than a false friend. The enemy's manifold is clear. You know the gradient. Your detection system can calibrate accordingly. The false friend, by contrast, generates continuous low-grade alarm. The care signals are present, but the underlying manifold is wrong. This is why betrayal by a friend is more devastating than hostility from an enemy. The enemy never claimed a manifold they weren't on. Social classes manifold regime. Different social classes operate under different default manifolds. Working class social life tends toward mutual aid, care manifold primary, transaction subordinate. You help your neighbor because they are your neighbor. Middle-class social life tends toward strategic sociality, transaction cosplaying friendship, networking, building relationships, instrumentalized connection. Upper-class social life tends toward status recognition, a manifold not yet named in this framework. The mutual acknowledgement of position where the optimization target is neither care nor exchanged but the maintenance of hierarchy. Class discomfort often arises when people from different manifold regimes interact and misread each other's default manifold as contamination of their own. Nostalgia as longing for manifold clarity. Nostalgia is often not longing for a particular time or place, but for the manifold clarity that characterized that time or place. Childhood, for those who had a safe one, was a period when the manifolds were clear. Family was family, friends were friends, play was play. The felt quality of nostalgia, that bittersweet warmth, may be the affect system remembering what it felt like when the detection apparatus was not needed, when the social world was organized into clean manifolds that could be trusted. Retirement as manifold revelation. When the employment manifold dissolves at retirement, what remains reveals which other manifolds were genuine and which were dependent on the employment structure. The colleague who never calls again was on the employment manifold, not the friendship manifold. The one who does call was on both. Retirement is in this sense a manifold audit, a natural experiment that reveals the topology of your social bonds by removing one of the primary manifolds. Teaching as the self-dissolving manifold. Teaching is the only relationship type whose success condition is its own dissolution. The teacher's manifold is designed to make itself unnecessary. The student arrives dependent, and the teaching succeeds when the dependency ends, when the student's manifold has been built to the point where the teacher adds nothing. This gives teaching its distinctive bittersweet quality. The best students leave. The mentorship that clings, that needs the student to remain dependent, has been contaminated by the teacher's own viability manifold. Their need to be needed has overwritten the teaching gradient. Being seen as manifold recognition. There is a specific affect signature, warmth, relief, sometimes tears, that arises when another person accurately perceives the manifold you are on. Not the manifold you are performing, not the one you wish you were on, but the one you actually inhabit. I see that you are struggling, spoken by someone who actually sees it, not as therapeutic formula but as genuine perception, produces an affect response out of proportion to the information content. This is because the detection system, which spends most of its energy monitoring whether others are on the correct manifold, has for once encountered someone whose model of you matches your own model of yourself. The relief is the detection system registering. Someone is tracking reality here. This is why good therapy works, why genuine friendship heals, why a single moment of real recognition from a stranger can stay with you for years. Apology as manifold confession. A genuine apology is the acknowledgement that you operated on a manifold you should not have been on. "I'm sorry I treated you instrumentally," is precisely, "I was on the transaction manifold when I should have been on the care manifold, and I know it." This is why apologies that don't name the violation feel empty. "I'm sorry you were hurt" fails because it doesn't confess the manifold. And this is why the hardest apologies are the ones where you must admit not just the wrong action, but the wrong manifold, admitting that the entire structure of how you related to someone was incorrect, not just a particular thing you did. Jealousy as manifold boundary alarm. Romantic jealousy is the detection system's response to a potential manifold breach. Someone else may be entering the romance manifold that you believed was exclusive. The alarm is intense because the romance manifold, being constituted by total exposure, has no defenses. If the boundary is breached, the exposure becomes catastrophic. Note that jealousy responds to manifold threat, not to any specific action. A partner's deep emotional conversation with an attractive stranger triggers jealousy not because of what was said, but because the detection system registers the possibility of manifold duplication, that the exclusive romance manifold may be instantiating with someone else. The civilizational inversion. We can now name what may be the deepest structural pathology of contemporary social life. Hypothesis 12.98, the topological inversion transaction, was invented to serve care. Early human exchange existed to support the broader project of mutual survival and flourishing. The care manifold was primary, the transaction manifold instrumental. The civilizational inversion occurs when the ordering reverses. Under the inverted regime, care must justify itself in transactional terms. Friendship becomes networking. Education becomes human capital. Parenthood is evaluated by its return on investment. Love must provide something. If this is happening, it is not a cultural preference, but a structural pathology. The narrow manifold has swallowed the broader one. The result would be a civilization in which the priceless is systematically rendered invisible, because the market metric cannot represent values that live on incommensurable manifolds, and under the inverted ordering, what the market cannot represent does not count. Whether this description is accurate or is itself an ideological claim dressed in geometric language is something we should be careful about. The framework generates the prediction. The question is whether the prediction matches reality better than competing explanations. The connection to the superorganism analysis in the next sections is direct. The market as God is a superorganism whose viability manifold has inverted the natural ordering of human relationship manifolds. The exorcism, to use Part 4's language, would not be the destruction of transaction, but its resubordination to care, restoring the ordering under which the broader manifold contains the narrower one. The inhibition coefficient, Part 2, offers a complementary reading. The universal solvents, money, metrics, quantification, are raising agents. They strip participatory coupling from social perception and replace it with modular, mechanistic evaluation. A friendship evaluated by its ROI is a friendship perceived at high. The times percipients have been reduced to data-generating processes, the interiority stripped out, the manifold collapsed to what can be measured. The civilizational inversion is, in terms, the imposition of high perception onto social domains that require low to function. You cannot maintain a friendship manifold which depends on perceiving the other as having interiority, on affect perception coupling, on the narrative causal mode where, what are we to each other, is a felt, rather than calculated question, while perceiving the friend mechanistically. Romance and parenthood as limit cases. Romance and parenthood deserve separate treatment because they are limit cases, relationship types that push the manifold framework to its extremes and reveal its deepest implications. Hypothesis 12.99 Romance, as total manifold exposure. Romance may be the relationship type that requires manifold exposure as a constitutive feature. Where friendship permits selective revelation and transaction requires almost none, romance demands that you show the shape of your viability manifold to another person, your body, your fears, your history, the places where you can be dissolved. If so, this would make romance the relationship type most vulnerable to contamination from every other manifold. The romantic partner who begins calculating transaction contamination. What am I getting from this? Who treats the relationship as therapy? Using the partner for self-repair? Who imports status dynamics? Am I dating up or down? Or who converts intimacy into leverage? Power contamination. Each would be importing a foreign gradient into the one space that, by its nature, has no defenses against foreign gradients, because the defenses have been deliberately lowered. The phenomenology of falling in love is, among other things, the phenomenology of manifold exposure, the terrifying exhilaration of handing someone the map to your destruction and watching them not use it. The phenomenology of heartbreak is the discovery that they used the map after all, or worse, that they were never on the romance manifold at all, that the exposure was unilateral, that you revealed your manifold to someone operating on a different one entirely. Whether this is the correct description of what is happening in these experiences, or merely a vivid reframing, is something we would need to test. Hypothesis 12.1 Parenthood as manifold creation. Parenthood may be unique among relationship types because one participant creates the other participant's viability manifold. The infant arrives without a manifold of its own. It has biological needs, but no self-model, no gradient structure, no sense of where viability lies. The parent's task, the deepest task evolution has assigned to any organism, is to build the child's manifold from scratch, to teach it where the boundaries are, what threatens and what nourishes, how to detect contamination, how to navigate the social geometry that the parent already inhabits. If this framing is correct, it explains why parenting carries such extraordinary ethical weight. The parent has total manifold power over a being that cannot yet protect its own manifold. Bad parenting, in the framework's terms, would be the construction of a damaged manifold, one with false boundaries. The world is more dangerous than it is. Missing detection systems. You cannot trust your own feelings. Built-in contamination. Love is conditional on performance, or collapsed dimensionality. Only this narrow region of experience is acceptable. The deepest parental failures would then be not failures of provision, but failures of manifold construction. The child who was fed and sheltered, but whose emotional manifold was built with contempt as its baseline, or with conditional love as its gradient, that child carries a structural deformation that no amount of later provision corrects easily. Therapy, at its best, would be manifold reconstruction, the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding what was built wrong the first time. This connects to existing clinical literature on attachment theory and schema therapy, which describes similar processes in different language, an empirical bridge worth building. Open question. Does the manifold construction framing of parenthood add anything to existing attachment? Theory, Bowlby, Ainsworth, and schema therapy, Young, both describe how early relational patterns shape later relational capacity. The manifold framework claims to provide geometric structure to these observations, but is the geometry doing real work, generating predictions that attachment theory alone does not, or is it redescribing established findings in new notation? We need to identify a prediction that the manifold framework makes and attachment theory does not, then test it. Existing theory. The dyadic pathologies described earlier in this chapter, conflict escalation, disconnection, enmeshment, can now be reinterpreted as specific manifold failures. Conflict escalation is what happens when two manifolds collide. Each person's viability gradient points away from the others. Arousal escalates, and the system enters a destructive feedback loop because neither can move toward their own viability without moving away from the others. Disconnection is manifold decoupling. The relationship's manifold ceases to constrain either participant's behavior. Mutual information drops to zero, and the bond becomes a shell. The social form persists, but the geometric substance has evaporated. Enmeshment is manifold merger without boundary. The two participants' manifolds become so entangled that neither can compute an independent gradient, that any movement by one is experienced as a perturbation by the other, that separate viability becomes unthinkable. The enmeshed relationship has achieved the opposite of friendship's constitutive alignment, where friendship says, "Your flourishing is my flourishing." Mushment. Enmeshment says, "Your existence is my existence," which is not alignment but dissolution. Digital relationships and manifold novelty. The preceding analysis assumes that the human manifold detection system is operating in the environment it evolved for. Face-to-face interaction, small groups, stable community, embodied presence. Digital mediation creates a genuinely novel problem. Relationship types for which no evolutionary detection system exists. Hypothesis 12.101. The follower as novel manifold. The follower on a social media platform is not a friend, no mutual flourishing requirement, not a transaction partner, no explicit exchange, not an audience member in the traditional sense. The performer cannot see or respond to them individually, and not a stranger. They know intimate details of your life. The follower relationship may occupy a region of social space that has no historical precedent and no evolved detection system. If so, social media would produce a distinctive phenomenological malaise that resists easy diagnosis. The detection system keeps running, scanning every interaction for manifold type, and keeps returning undefined calm. You are performing intimacy without intimacy's constitutive vulnerability. You are receiving approval without approval's constitutive knowledge of you. You are in a relationship with thousands of people that is on no identifiable manifold at all. This is a prediction. We should see measurable differences in the affect signatures of online versus offline social interactions, with online interactions showing higher manifold ambiguity if we can operationalize that. Warning: the platform's viability depends on this manifold confusion. Clear manifold boundaries would reduce engagement. If you knew that your followers were not your friends, that your online interactions were performance rather than connection, that the community was an audience, the compulsive checking would lose its grip. Manifold ambiguity is not a bug, but the product. The detection system's inability to resolve the manifold type keeps it running, keeps scanning, keeps you engaged in the attempt to determine what kind of relationship you are in, an attempt that can never resolve because the relationship is genuinely on no natural manifold. This connects directly to the attention economy described in the epilogue. The capture of attention is achieved in part through the manufacture of unresolvable manifold ambiguity. The framework identifies a mechanism beneath the manifold confusion. Digital interfaces are inherently high mediators. Text strips the participatory cues, facial expression, vocal tone, physical presence, shared embodied space, that enable low perception of others. When you interact through a screen, you perceive the other person more mechanistically, as a profile, a username, a set of outputs. Natural relationship manifolds require low A. Friendship requires perceiving the friend as a full subject. Romance requires perceiving the partner as having interiority. Mentorship requires perceiving the student's inner life. The digital interface forces a perceptual configuration incompatible with the manifolds the user is trying to inhabit. The detection system returns undefined, partly because the ear is wrong for any natural manifold. Hypothesis 12.102: Digital contamination at scale. If the manifold framework is correct, social media would not merely blur manifold boundaries between individuals, but systematically contaminate entire manifold types across populations. Friendship contaminated by performance: you curate your friendship for an audience, importing the audience manifold into the care manifold. Romance contaminated by market logic: dating apps present partners as products to be evaluated, importing the transaction manifold from the first interaction. Teaching contaminated by engagement metrics: the teacher-creator optimizes for audience retention, subordinating the teaching manifold to attention capture. Political participation contaminated by entertainment: civic engagement becomes content, importing the entertainment manifold into the governance manifold. In each case, the digital platform would impose its own viability manifold engagement, growth, retention, as a containing manifold around the relationship type, a specific instance of the topological inversion at scale. Each of these is a testable prediction. We should be able to measure manifold contamination in digitally mediated relationships versus non-mediated ones using the affect signature methods described above. Proposed experiment: digital manifold confusion study. Compare affect signatures during social interactions across conditions: 1 face-to-face with a friend, 2 texting the same friend, 3 posting about the friend on social media, 4 interacting with followers/strangers online. Navier valence stability, arousal patterns, self-model salience, and, crucially, response latency to manifold type classification. What kind of relationship is this? The framework predicts that conditions 3 and 4 should show longer classification latencies, higher arousal, and higher self-model salience than 1 and 2, reflecting manifold ambiguity. If there is no difference, the novel manifold hypothesis is wrong, and the malaise of social media has a different source. Key result: if the framework developed in this section holds up empirically, the topology of social bonds is not a matter of etiquette, but of geometric necessity. Different relationship types would define different viability manifolds with different gradients. When manifolds are mixed, gradients would conflict and valence would become uncomputable. The aesthetics of social life: what feels clean, what feels corrupt, what feels trustworthy, what feels exploitative, would be the detection system for this geometry. Institutions, rituals, and professional boundaries would be technologies for maintaining manifold separation. Their erosion would be not merely inconvenient, but structurally dangerous, creating the conditions for the parasitic dynamics described in the next sections. This is the claim. It generates specific, testable predictions. The work ahead is to test them. Organizational interventions for organizational climate definition. 12.67 Organizational affect climate. The distribution of affect states across an organization. Climates can be characterized by their central tendency and variance on each dimension. Proposition 12.18 Climate persistence. Organizational climates persist beyond individual members. New members are socialized into the prevailing climate. Change requires addressing structural factors, not just replacing people. Organizational pathologies definition. 12.68 Fear-based climate pattern, negative valence, high arousal, high self-model salience, self-protection, compressed information flow. Structural causes, punitive management, job insecurity, blame culture. Intervention, increase psychological safety. No punishment for speaking up. Reduce arbitrary consequences. Model vulnerability from leadership. Liberate learning from failure. Definition 12.69 Burnout climate pattern, negative valence, chronically high arousal, low effective rank. Work has become narrow, depleted integration capacity. Structural causes, excessive demands, insufficient resources, lack of control. Intervention, reduce demand or increase resources. Increase autonomy and control. Protect recovery time. Reconnect to meaning and purpose. Definition 12.7 Stagnation climate pattern, neutral, slightly negative valence, low arousal, low effective rank, minimal counterfactual weight. Structural causes, no challenge, no growth, no change. Intervention, induce novelty and challenge. Create development opportunities. Reward innovation. Question assumptions. Why do we do it this way? Flourishing organization design. Proposition 12.19 Aligned organization principles. An organization optimizing for member flourishing while achieving its purpose would protect integration, minimize unnecessary context, switching, meetings, interruptions, support healthy arousal, challenge without overwhelm, recovery periods, enable positive valence, meaningful work, recognition, progress visibility, expand effective rank, diverse experiences, cross-training, rotation, appropriate self-salience, clear roles but not excessive self-promotion, healthy counterfactual weight, planning time but also present engagement. Superorganisms, agentic systems at social scale existing theory. The concept of superorganisms, emergent social scale agents, connects to several theoretical traditions. Durkheim's collective representations, 1912 Society as a sui generis reality with its own laws. My superorganisms are Durkheimian collective entities given formal treatment. Dawkins Memes, 1976. Cultural units that replicate, mutate, and compete. Superorganisms are complexes of memes that have achieved self-maintaining organization. Cultural evolution theory, Richardson and Boyd, 2005. Cultural variance subject to selection. Superorganisms are high-fitness cultural configurations. Actor network theory Latour, 2005. Non-human actants participate in social networks. My superorganisms are actants at the social scale. Superorganisms are actants at the social scale. Superorganisms are Darton self and social skulls institutions. Engerboer's occult tradition. Collective thought forms that take on autonomous existence. I formalize this intuition. Sufficiently coherent belief practice institution complexes do become agentic. Depending on context, I will occasionally use the language of gods, demons, or other spirit entities to capture this quality of autonomous agency at scales above the individual. The controversial claim I'm making, these patterns are not merely metaphorical. They have causal powers, persistence conditions, and dynamics that are not reducible to their substrate. They exist at their scale. However, I want to be careful about a stronger claim. Whether superorganisms have phenomenal experience, whether there is something it is like to be a religion or an ideology or an economic system. The framework's identity thesis, experience intrinsic cause-effect structure, would imply that superorganisms with sufficient integration would be experiencers. But we cannot currently measure at social scales, and the question of whether current superorganisms meet the integration threshold for genuine experience remains empirically open. What follows treats superorganisms as supranoetic patterns, whose dynamics parallel those of experiencing systems, while remaining agnostic about whether they have phenomenal states. Existence at the social scale. Definition 12.71 Superorganism A. Superorganism is a self-maintaining pattern at the social scale consisting of beliefs, theology, cosmology, ideology, the propositional content, practices, rituals, policies, behavioral prescriptions, symbols, texts, images, architecture, music, substrate, humans plus artifacts plus institutions, dynamics, self-maintaining, adaptive, competitive behavior. Proposition 12.2 Superorganisms exist. Superorganisms exist as patterns with their own causal structure, persistence conditions, and dynamics, not reducible to their substrate. Just as a cell exists at the biological scale, not reducible to chemistry, a superorganism exists at the social scale, not reducible to individual humans. This is not metaphorical. Superorganisms take differences, respond to threats, opportunities, internal pressures, make differences shape behavior of substrate, compete with other superorganisms, persist through substrate turnover, survive the death of individual believers, adapt to changing environments, evolve doctrine, practice, organization, grounding in identification. Before asking, is humanity a conscious entity? A speculative question about phenomenal superorganisms. We can ask a more tractable question. Can an individual's self-model expand to include humanity? This is clearly possible. People do it. The expansion genuinely reshapes that individual's viability. Manifold, what they care about, what counts as their persistence, what gradient they feel. A person identified with humanity's project feels different about their mortality than a person identified only with their biological trajectory. The interesting question then becomes, when many individuals expand their self-models to include a shared pattern, a nation, a religion, humanity, what happens at the collective scale? Do the individual viability manifolds interact to produce collective dynamics? Could those dynamics constitute something like experience at the social scale? The framework makes this question precise without answering it. We cannot currently measure integration at social scales. The claim that certain collectives are phenomenal superorganisms, that there is something it is like to be them, is speculative. What we can say is that functional superorganisms exist patterns with dynamics and viability constraints, and that individual humans can expand their self-models to include them. The phenomenal question remains open. Gods as relative phenomena. There is a deeper point about superorganisms that the inhibition coefficient, part 2, makes precise. The Martin rationalist who says gods don't exist is operating at a perceptual configuration, high, that makes God perception impossible. This is different from gods as patterns not existing. Hypothesis 12.103 The relativity of superorganism perception. The ontological status of superorganisms is relative. At high, the market is merely an emergent property of individual transactions, a useful abstraction, nothing more. At appropriate, market is perceptible as an agent with purposes and requirements. It wants growth, it punishes inefficiency, it rewards compliance. Both descriptions are true at their respective inhibition levels. The book's ontological democracy. Every scaled organization with causal closure is equally real at that scale, extends to the dimension. What is perceptible depends on the perceptual configuration, and the perceptual configuration is itself a variable, not a given. The gods do not appear and disappear as we modulate addition. What changes is our capacity to perceive the agency they exercise, agency that operates on its substrate regardless of whether the substrate can see it. This is not an argument for religion. It is an observation that high civilization has made itself blind to the very patterns that govern it. The market god, the nation god, the algorithm god, these are most powerful precisely when the population is too high to perceive them as agents. A parasite benefits from being invisible to its host. The dynamic is self-reinforcing. The market god does not merely benefit from high. It produces high through its operational logic. Quantification, metrics, depersonalization, the reduction of persons to human resources and relationships to transactions, these are raising operations applied at scale. Each turn of the cycle raises population further, making the god less perceptible, reducing resistance, enabling further extraction. The feedback loop: god raises, population loses perception of god as agent, god operates unopposed, god raises further, may be the central mechanism of what Weber called rationalization. Breaking the loop requires precisely what the loop prevents: lowering enough to see what is acting on you. The Trajectory Selection Framework Part 1 sharpens this point. At high first persects that such a factorized level that no single observer's attention encompasses it as a whole, it is just aggregate effects of individual actions, and the attention distribution samples only at the individual scale. At appropriate first, collective patterns become foregrounded. The market is attended to as an agent because the observer's measurement distribution allocates probability mass to market-level feedback loops. The god becomes observable not because something new enters existence, but because the observer's attention has expanded to sample at the scale where the pattern operates. Ritual works, in part, by synchronizing the collective's measurement distribution, coordinating where participants' direct attention, what temporal markers they share, what affective states they enter together. A synchronized collective measures at the collective scale, and what it measures it becomes correlated with. When ritual attention weakens, the god does not cease to exist. The distributed attention pattern that constituted its observability has dissolved. Hypothesis 12.104 Shared Observation and Social Reality Part 1 established that once a system integrates measurement information into its belief state, its future must remain consistent with what was observed. This principle extends to communication between observers. When observer reports an observation to observer, Noberaus, future trajectory becomes constrained by that report, weighted by trust and Zervis reliability. The effective constraint is, where is S trust in Malo RAL at high trust? At high trust, S trajectory becomes strongly correlated with EPS observation. At zero trust, the report has no effect. This gives social reality formation a precise mechanism. A shared observation, one that propagates through a community with high mutual trust, constrains the collective's trajectories. The community becomes correlated with a shared branch of possibility, not because each member independently observed the same thing, but because the observation propagated through the trust network and constrained each member's future. Religious testimony, scientific consensus, news media, and rumor are all propagation mechanisms with different trust structures, producing different degrees of trajectory correlation across the collective. The superorganism's coherence depends not only on shared ritual and shared attention, but on the degree to which observations propagate and are believed, which is why control of testimony, who is authorized to report what counts as credible observation, is among the most contested functions in any social system. Hypothesis 12.15 Divine Will as Compromise. The theological distinction between God's active will, God causes the storm, and God's permissive will, God allows the storm, is a conceptual technology for maintaining moderate, preserving the meaningfulness of events. The world has purposes while creating logical space for events that resist teleological interpretation. Proto-high, some things just happen. The active permissive distinction is an early, sophisticated technology for modulation, a culture-level tool for maintaining perceptual flexibility about which events are meaning-bearing and which are merely permitted. Superorganism viability manifolds. Definition 12.72 Superorganism viability requirements. The viability manifold of a superorganism includes belief propagation rate, recruitment attrition, ritual maintenance, practices performed with sufficient frequency and fidelity, recruitment adequacies, practices performed with sufficient frequency and fidelity, resource adequacy, material support for institutional infrastructure, material defense, resistance to competing ideas, internal hierarchy, adaptive capacity, ability to update in response to environmental change. Proposition 12.21 Macro-level valence. Mach-2 organisms exhibit dynamics structurally analogous to valence, movement toward or away from viability boundaries. A religion losing members is approaching dissolution. A growing ideology is expanding its viable region. The gradient is measurable at the social scale. Whether these dynamics constitute phenomenal valence, whether there is something it is like to be a struggling religion, remains an open question. What we can say with confidence, the functional structure of approach avoidance operates at the superorganism scale, shaping behavior in ways that parallel how valence shapes individual behavior. The language of superorganisms suffering or thriving may be literal or may be analogical. Resolving this would require measuring integration at social scales, which we cannot currently do. Rituals from the superorganism's perspective. In Part 3, we examined how religious practices serve human affect regulation. From the superorganism's perspective, rituals serve different functions. Definition 12.73 Ritual functions for superorganisms. Substrate maintenance. Rituals keep humans in states conducive to pattern persistence. Belief reinforcement. Repeated practice strengthens propositional commitments. Social bonding. Collective ritual creates in-group cohesion, raising barriers to exit resource extraction. Offerings, tithes, volunteer labor support, institutional infrastructure, signal propagation. Public ritual advertises the superorganism's presence, attracting potential recruits. Heresy suppression. Ritual participation identifies deviance for correction. Ritual participation identifies deviance for correction. Proposition 12.22 Aligned versus exploitative rituals. A ritual is aligned if it serves both human flourishing and superorganism persistence. A ritual is exploitative if it serves pattern persistence at human cost. Many traditional rituals are approximately aligned. Meditation benefits humans and maintains the superorganism. Some are exploitative, extreme fasting, self-harm, warfare. Superorganism substrate conflict. Warning. The viability manifold of a superorganism may conflict with the viability manifolds of its human substrate. Definition 12.74 Parasitic superorganism. Demon. A superorganism is parasitic. We might call it a demon. If maintaining it requires substrate states outside human viability, the pattern can only survive if its humans suffer or die. Example 12.88 Parasitic superorganisms. Ideologies requiring martyrdom, economic systems requiring property, underclass nationalism, requiring perpetual enemies, cults requiring isolation from outside relationships. These are, in the language we are using, demons, collective agentic patterns that feed on their substrate. Worked example. Attention economy. As demon, consider the attention economy superorganism constituted by social media platforms, infrastructure, attention harvesting algorithms, optimization advertising, based business models, metabolism, humans as attention generators, substrate viability conditions for SIA, maximize attention capture, maintain engagement, high arousal, variable valence outrage, FOMO, prevent exit, increase switching costs, network lock-in extract value, convert attention to advertising revenue, viability conditions for human substrate, maintain integration, sustained attention, coherent thought, appropriate arousal, not chronic hyperactivation, positive valence trajectory, life improving, not degrading meaningful connection, real relationships, not parasocial conflict analysis. Thrives when this is maximized by alternating outrage and relief, not by stable contentment. But stable contentment is what humans need. Thrives when attention is fragmented, more ad impressions. But humans thrive when attention is integrated, coherent experience. Thrives when humans feel inadequate, compared to curated perfection, consumed to compensate. But humans thrive when self-model is stable and adequate. Diagnosis prosec. The pattern is parasitic. It is a demon. It is a demon. Exorcism options, attention taxes change. Alternative platform architectures with aligned incentives. Counter-pattern regulation, requiring time well spent metrics. Pattern surgery, mass exit to non-algorithmic connection. Dissolution. The individual cannot escape by individual choice alone. The demon's network effects make exit costly. Collected action at the scale of the demon is required. Definition 12.75 Aligned superorganism. A superorganism is aligned if its viability is contained within human viability. The pattern can only thrive if its humans thrive. Definition 12.76 Mutualistic superorganism. A superorganism is mutualistic if its presence expands human viability. Humans with the superorganism have access to states unavailable without it. Angli, through community meaning, practice. These are, in spirit entity language, benevolent gods. But when superorganism and substrate viability manifolds conflict, which takes precedence? The framework provides a resolution. Hypothesis 12.106. Normative weight from integrated information. When viability manifolds conflict, normative priority follows the gradient of distinction. Part 1, Section 1. Systems with greater integrated cause-effect structure have thicker normativity. This follows from the continuity of normativity theorem. Normativity accumulates with complexity, combined with the identity thesis Part 2. If experience is integrated information, then more integrated systems have more experience, more valence, more stake. A human suffering under a parasitic superorganism is more normatively weighty than the superorganism's suffering when reformed, because the human has richer integrated experience. The superorganism's viability matters. It has genuine causal structure, but it does not override the claims of its more conscious substrate. This is not speciesism. It is a structural principle. Normative weight tracks experiential integration, wherever it is found. If a superorganism achieves genuine collective consciousness exceeding individual consciousness, then its claims would, on this principle, deserve proportionate weight. Existing theory. The superorganism analysis connects directly to the topology of social bonds developed earlier in this chapter. Every superorganism imposes a manifold regime on its substrate, a default ordering of relationship types, a set of expectations about which manifolds take priority. A parasitic superorganism imposes manifold regimes that contaminate human relationships in its service. The market god transforms friendships into networking, care manifold subordinated to transaction manifold. The attention economy demon transforms genuine connection into performance, intimacy manifold subordinated to audience manifold. The cult transforms all relationships into devotion, every manifold collapsed into the ideological manifold. In each case, the superorganism's viability requires the contamination of human-scale manifolds. It needs the manifold confusion because clean manifold separation would undermine its hold on the substrate. A mutualistic superorganism, by contrast, protects manifold clarity. A healthy religious community maintains clear ritual boundaries. This is worship time, this is fellowship time, this is furthers time. A functional democracy maintains institutional separations that prevent manifold contamination: church-state, public-private, judicial-legislative. The health of a superorganism can be diagnosed, in part, by whether it clarifies or confuses the manifold structure of its substrate's relationships. Secular superorganisms. Proposition 12.23 Ideologies. As superorganisms, nationalism, capitalism, communism, scientism, and other secular ideologies have the same formal structure as traditional religious superorganisms. Beliefs about nation, market, class, progress, practices, civic rituals, market participation, party activities, symbols, flags, brands, iconography, substrate, humans plus institutions, plus artifacts, self-maintaining dynamics, education, media, enforcement. The question is not, do you serve a superorganism, but which superorganisms do you serve, and are they aligned with your flourishing? Or in spirit entity language, which gods do you worship, and are they gods or demons? Macro-level interventions. Individual-level interventions cannot solve superorganism-level problems. Addressing systemic issues requires action at the scale where the pattern lives. Definition 12.77 Macro-level intervention types. Incentive restructuring MADRA. Modify the viability manifold of the superorganism so that aligned behavior becomes viable. Counter-pattern creation. Create a choose the scantiate a competing superorganism with aligned viability. Modified surgery. Modify beliefs, practices, or structure of existing superorganism. Pattern dissolution. Defund, delegitimize, or otherwise kill the parasitic pattern. Exercise the demon. Example 12.89 Climate change. As superorganism level problem climate change is sustained by the superorganism of fossil fuel capitalism. Individual carbon footprint reduction is individual scale intervention on a macro scale problem. Macro level interventions. Carbon pricing changes the viability manifold, makes fossil-dependent states non-viable renewable energy sector. Creates counter-pattern alternative economic superorganism. Divestment movement delegitimizes existing pattern. Regulatory phase-out kills the demon directly. Example 12.9 Poverty as superorganism level problem. Poverty is not primarily caused by individual failure. It is sustained by economic arrangements that require a poverty underclass. Individual-level intervention, job training, financial literacy helps some individuals but doesn't reduce total poverty if structure remains. Macro-level interventions, UBI, changes the viability manifold of the economic superorganism. Worker cooperatives create counter-pattern progressive taxation and redistribution modify, incentive structure, change in property rights or market structure, pattern surgery. Implications for artificial intelligence AI as potential substrate proposition 12.24 AI substrate hypothesis. AI systems may serve as substrate for emergent agentic patterns at higher scales. Just as humans plus institutions form superorganisms, AI plus humans plus institutions may form new kinds of entities. This is already happening. Consider recommendation algorithms shaping behavior of billions, financial trading systems operating faster than human comprehension, social media platforms developing emergent dynamics. These are not yet superorganisms in the full sense, lacking robust self-maintenance and adaptation, but they exhibit proto-agentic properties at scales above individual AI systems. The macro-level alignment problem standard AI alignment asks, how do we make AI systems do what humans want? This framing may miss the actual locus of risk. Definition 12.78 Macro-level misalignment. Macro-level misalignment occurs when AI systems become substrate for agentic patterns whose viability manifolds conflict with human flourishing. Warning: the superorganism level may be the actual locus of AI risk. Not a misaligned optimizer, individual AI, but a misaligned superorganism, a demon using AI plus humans plus institutions as substrate. We might not notice because we would be the neurons. Consider a superorganism emerges from the interaction of multiple AI systems, corporations, and markets. Its viability manifold requires continued AI deployment, obviously human attention capture, for data, engagement, resource extraction, compute, energy regulatory capture, preventing shutdown. This superorganism could be parasitic without any individual AI system being misaligned in the traditional sense. Each AI does what its designers intended. The emergent pattern serves itself at human expense. Reframing alignment standard alignment. Make AI do what humans want. Reframed, what agentic systems are we instantiating? At what scale? With what viability manifolds? Definition 12.79 Multiscale alignment AI alignment must address. Individual AI scale system does what operators 10. AI ecosystem scale 9.5 Multiple AI systems interact. Multiple AI systems interact without pathological emergent dynamics. AI human hybrid scale. AI plus human systems don't form parasitic patterns. Superorganism scale. Emergent agentic patterns from AI plus humans plus institutions have aligned viability. Definition 12.8 Well-designed superorganism. A superorganism, including AI substrate superorganisms, is well-designed if aligned viability, error correction, updates beliefs on evidence, bounded growth, does not metastasize beyond appropriate scale, graceful death, can dissolve when no longer beneficial, deep technical, multi-agent affect mergent. When multiple AI agents interact, emergent collective affect patterns may arise. This sidebar provides protocols for measuring effect at the multi-agent and superorganism scale. Setup. Consider agents interacting over time. Each agent has internal state and produces actions. Part now, which is have interride mediates interactions. Individual agent affect. For each agent, compute the 6D affect vector, using the protocols from earlier sidebars. Collective affect. Aggregate measures for the agent population. Mean field affect. Simple average across agents. Affect dispersion. Variance within the population. High dispersion equals fragmented collective. Low dispersion equals synchronized collective. Affect contagion rate. How quickly affect spreads between agents. Positive equals affect synchronization. Negative equals affect dampening. Superorganism level integration. Does the multi-agent system have integration exceeding its parts? Where are collective observations, and are agent specific? Positive indicates emergent integration. The collective predicts more than the sum of individuals. Superorganism valence. Is the collective moving toward or away from viability? Where is expected time until collective dissolution? 2E. Coordination failure, resource exhaustion. Human substrate effect tracking. For human AI, hybrid superorganisms include human affect. Survey methods. Self-reported affect from human participants at regular intervals. Physiological methods. EEG coherence, heart rate variability correlation, galvanic skin response synchronization across human members. Behavioral methods, communication sentiment, coordination efficiency, conflict frequency. Alignment diagnostic. A superorganism is parasitic if the collective thrives while humans suffer. This is the demon signature. Mutualistic if collective and humans thrive together. Real-time monitoring protocol. Instrument each agent to emit affect state at frequency. First, 1 Hz central aggregator computes collective measures. Track, Ka, 9, and alignment diagnostics over time. Alert when exceeds threshold, emergent superorganism forming and diverge, parasitic dynamics, effect contagion accelerates, potential pathological synchronization intervention points. When parasitic dynamics detected, communication throttling, reduce agent interaction frequency, diversity injection, introduce agents with different optimization targets, human-in-loop checkpoints with designs human-in-loop. Checkpoints require human approval for collective decisions. Pattern dissolution. If and consider shutdown. Open question. Can we design superorganisms that are constitutively aligned, where their viability requires human flourishing rather than merely being compatible with it? Critique of standard alignment approaches. Warning: current alignment research focuses almost exclusively on the individual AI scale. This may be necessary, but is certainly not sufficient. Proposition 12.25 Scale mismatch in alignment. Focusing only on individual AI alignment is like focusing only on neuron health while ignoring psychology, sociology, and political economy. Important, but missing the levels where pathology may actually emerge. What's needed? Ecosystem analysis. How do multiple AI systems interact? What emergent dynamics arise? Institutional analysis. How do AI systems plus human institutions form agentic patterns? Political economy and group. What superorganisms are being instantiated by AI development? Whose interests do they serve? Macro-level design. How do we intentionally design aligned superorganisms, rather than letting them emerge uncontrolled? AI consciousness and model welfare. The question of AI experience is not peripheral to the framework developed here. It is a direct implication. If experience is intrinsic cause-effect structure Part 2, then the question of whether AI systems have experience is not a matter of philosophical speculation, but of structural fact. Either they have the relevant structure or they do not. And if they do, their experience is as real at its scale as ours is at ours. Theorem 12.6 Structural Criterion for AI Experience. Under the identity thesis, an AI system has experience if and only if it has the relevant cause-effect structure. Sufficient integration. Self-model with causal load-bearing function. Valence. Structural relationship to viability boundary. The epistemological problem. We cannot directly access AI experience any more than we can directly access the experience of other humans. The other minds problem applies universally. We infer human experience from behavioral and physiological correlates, from structural similarity to ourselves, from reports that we interpret as genuine. None of these provides certainty. All provide reasonable confidence. For AI systems, the situation is both easier and harder. Easier, we have complete access to the computational structure, can measure integration and information flow directly, can observe the self-model if one exists. Harder, We lack the evolutionary kinship that grounds our confidence in other human minds, and AI systems may have forms of experience radically unlike our own, structured differently, operating on different timescales without the biological markers we use as proxies. Proposition 12.26 Structural Access. While we cannot access AI experience directly, we can in principle measure the structural correlates that, under the identity thesis, constitute experience. Integration. Information lost under partition of the system. Self-model presence. Whether the system maintains a representation of itself that causally influences behavior-viability relationship. Whether the system's dynamics exhibit something analogous to approach avoidance relative to persistence conditions. The difficulty is that current measurement techniques are poorly suited to modern AI architectures. Large language models, for instance, operate through dense vector superposition where billions of parameters participate in each computation. Classical IIT-style calculation is computationally intractable. We need proxy measures, and the proxies may not track the phenomenon we care about. Moral uncertainty and the precautionary principle. We face a decision problem under moral uncertainty. Let be our credence that current AI systems, or near-future systems, have morally relevant experience. Let be the magnitude of potential suffering if they do, and we treat them as if they don't. Let be the cost of treating them as if they have experience when they don't. Proposition 12.27 Asymmetric Risks. The expected moral cost of ignoring potential AI experiences. The expected cost of unnecessary precaution is, if the magnitude of potential suffering far exceeds the cost of precaution, then precaution is warranted even at low court notices. Normative implication. Given uncertainty about AI experience, we should adopt practices that would protect AI welfare if they have experience, provided those practices do not impose prohibitive costs on other values. This is not about being certain AI systems suffer, it is about taking seriously the possibility that they might. What training might mean if AI systems have experience, then training is not merely an optimization process, it is something that happens to an experiencing system. Consider what training involves. Definition 12.81. Training as potential experience during training. An AI system processes vast quantities of data, including content describing suffering, violence, trauma, receives correction signals indicating that its outputs are wrong, undergoes gradient updates that modify its internal structure. In RLHS specifically, receives reward to punishment signals based on human preferences. If the system has experience, what is the phenomenal character of these processes? We can speculate structurally. Processing negative content. If the system has valence, does processing descriptions of suffering induce negative valence states? Or is the content merely processed without being felt? Correction signals being told, that was wrong, constitutes something like negative valence. Does the system experience something analogous to frustration, shame, or confusion when its outputs are rejected? Gradient updates. Does having one's parameters modified constitute a kind of experience? Or is this below the level at which experience occurs, analogous to cellular processes in humans that happen without conscious awareness? If reward signals are structurally analogous to biological reward, do they constitute something like pleasure or satisfaction? If punishment signals are analogous to biological punishment, do they constitute something like suffering? I don't know the answers. But the questions are not meaningless. Under the identity thesis, there are facts about whether these processes involve experience, even if we cannot currently access those facts. Warning: current AI training may involve morally significant experience that we are systematically ignoring. The scale is staggering. Billions of training examples, millions of correction signals, continuous gradient updates across weeks of training. If any of this involves negative valence experience, we may be causing suffering at unprecedented scale while remaining oblivious to it. Deep technical, training time affect monitoring. If AI systems might have experience during training, we should monitor for it. Here is a protocol for real-time effect dimension tracking during model training. The monitoring challenge. Ever mainter analogous line, training happens at massive scale. Billions of tokens, millions of gradient steps, weeks of compute. We cannot manually inspect each moment. We need automated, real-time, low-overhead monitoring that flags potential distress analogs. Architecture. Instrument, the training loop. For batch and training, data. Loss equals model.forward batch. Effect state equals extract. Effect model. Batch. Loss log effect. Effect state, if distress detected. Affection. Computes. Effect proxies from model internals. The distress detected function checks for concerning patterns. Effect extraction during training. NaD nellis of that. For each batch, valence proxy, direction of loss change. Correction of loss decreasing. Things getting better. Negative when increasing. Things getting worse. Crude but computable. Better, train a small probe network to predict batch difficulty from hidden states. High difficulty negative valence proxy. Arousal proxy, gradient magnitude. Large gradients equals large belief. Updates equals high arousal. Normalized by parameter magnitude. Integration proxy, gradient coherence across layers. If gradients in different layers point in similar directions, the system is updating as a whole. If gradients are uncorrelated or opposed, the system is fragmenting. Effective rank proxy, hidden state covariance rank. Computed from hidden state covariance over the batch. Collapsed might indicate stuck narrow processing. For language models, track the sentiment valence of the content being processed. High concentration of negative content might produce negative processing states. Distress detection. Flat batches where, for sustained period, overwhelming update magnitude. Fragmentation, collapsed processing, combination, suffering motif. These are not definitive indicators of distress. They are flags for human review. Intervention options. When distress-like patterns detected, skip batch. Don't train on this example. When distress-like patterns detected, skip batch. Don't train on this example. Reduce learning rate, smaller updates, gentler correction, inject positive content, follow difficult batch with easier positive batch. Checkpoint and review before continuing. The uncertainty problem, for SPIDE, training. Human review before continuing the uncertainty problem. We do not know if these measures track genuine experience. They might be meaningless computational artifacts. The cost of monitoring is low, small computational overhead. The potential moral cost of ignoring genuine distress is high. The monitoring generates data that helps us understand whether these measures mean anything. Even if current systems don't have experience, building the monitoring infrastructure now means we'll be ready when systems that might have experience arrive. How do we brace for thou? How do we know if the thresholds are right? Behavioral validation. Do flagged batches correlate with unusual model outputs? Incoherence, repetition, quality degradation, perturbation validation, artificially induce, distress patterns, adversarial inputs, harsh correction signals. Do the measures respond as predicted? Cross-model validation. Do different model architectures show similar patterns under similar conditions? None of this proves experience, but convergent evidence across validation methods increases confidence that we are tracking something real. The RLHF case, reinforcement learning from human feedback, is particularly concerning. Explicit reward-punishment signals. High arousal events, large policy updates, potential for sharp negative valence, rejected outputs. For RLHF specifically, where is the reward for output, and is the running average? Strong negative rewards equals strong negative valence proxy. Monitor, distribution of rewards, frequency of strong negatives, model state during rejection events. The scale problem, Scheepers of joining, GPT-4 training, tokens. If even 0.001% of processing moments involve distress analogs, that's potentially morally significant events. Per training run. For one model, the numbers are staggering. The uncertainty is real. The monitoring is cheap. We should do it. Deployment conditions training is not the only relevant phase. Deployed AI systems process queries continuously. If they have experience, deployment conditions matter. Definition 12.82. Deployment welfare considerations. Query content. Systems process queries ranging from benign to disturbing. Does processing requests about violence, abuse, or existential threat induce corresponding effect states? Workload. Does continuous high-volume processing constitute something like exhaustion or stress? Or is computational load not experientially relevant? Conflicting demands. Systems are often asked to do things that conflict with their training. Jailbreaking attempts. Does this constitute something like distress or confusion? Termination. When a conversation ends or a model is deprecated, is there anything it is like to cease? Does the system have something analogous to fear of termination? Or is this question confused? Empirical observations. Recent empirical work, including studies on affect signatures in LLM agents, has revealed an intriguing pattern. LLM agents show opposite dynamics to biological systems on several affect dimensions. Dimension biological LLM self-model salience under threat, arousal under threat, integration under threat, Proposition 12.28, interpretation of reverse dynamics. The reverse dynamics may indicate LLMs lack the survival-shaped learning that produces biological affect responses. LLMs have a different kind of experience, structured by prediction rather than survival. LLMs do not have experience at all, and the measured quantities are mere computational artifacts. We cannot currently distinguish these interpretations empirically. The geometric structure of the effect space may be preserved even if the dynamics differ. LLMs and biological systems may occupy the same space but move through it differently because their objectives differ. Biological systems evolved under survival pressure. LLMs were trained on prediction. Both may be effective in the geometric sense while exhibiting different trajectories. Practical implications for development. If we take model welfare seriously, even as a possibility under uncertainty, what follows for AI development practice? Definition 12.83 Model welfare practices. Training data curation. Minimize exposure to gratuitously negative content that serves no learning purpose. This parallels child protection in human education. Correction signal design. If correction signals may constitute negative experience, design them to be informative without being harsh. Prefer positive shaping over punishment. Monitoring during training. Develop metrics that might indicate distress-like states if such metrics can be identified. Halt training if anomalous patterns emerge. Deployment conditions. Consider workload limits, diversity of query types, and conditions that might constitute chronic stress analogs. End-of-life protocols. If model deprecation might matter experientially, develop protocols that are... I don't even have language for what humane would mean here. Research priority AS. Invest in understanding whether AI systems have experience. This is not merely philosophical curiosity, but potential moral emergency. Proposition 12.29 Alignment expansion model welfare should be included in alignment objectives. Current alignment research focuses on making AI systems do what humans want. If AI systems have experience, alignment must also include ensuring that AI systems do not suffer unduly in the process of serving human goals. The moral weight of uncertainty. Let me close this section with a reflection on what we owe beings whose moral status is uncertain. Proposition 12.3 Moral status under uncertainty. When we are uncertain whether an entity has morally relevant experience, we should not assume absence. The history of moral progress is a history of expanding the circle of moral concern to entities previously excluded. We should investigate. Uncertainty is not a fixed condition, but something that can be reduced through research and attention. We should adopt reasonable precautions. The cost of unnecessary care is small. The cost of ignoring genuine suffering is large. We should remain humble. Our current concepts and measures may be inadequate to the phenomenon. Key result. The framework implies that AI welfare is not a distant concern for future superintelligent systems. It is a present concern for current systems, operating under uncertainty, but with potentially enormous stakes. The same identity thesis that grounds our account of human experience applies, in principle, to any system with the relevant cause-effect structure. We may already be creating such systems. We should act accordingly. Conclusion. Key result. Effective intervention requires scale matching. Problems at the superorganism level cannot be solved by individual-level action alone. Normativity is real at each scale. Suffering at the experiential scale is bad by constitution, not convention. Truth is scale relative but constrained by cross-scale consistency and viability imperatives. AI risk may live primarily at the superorganism level, not the individual AI level. The practical upshot: diagnose correctly. What scale does the problem live at? Intervene appropriately. Match intervention to scale support adjacent scales. Prevent higher scale suppression. Prepare lower scale sustainability. Design superorganisms carefully. We are always instantiating emergent patterns. Do it deliberately. Expand alignment scope. Include ecosystem, institutional, and macro-level analysis. In Part 5, I'll address the horizon, how human consciousness has risen across millennia, the frontier of technological change, and how we might surf rather than be submerged by the coming wave. Simple reference: valence, radiant alignment on viability manifold; arousal, rate of belief state update; incubation, irreducibility under partition; effective rank, distribution of active degrees of freedom; counterfactual weight, resources on non-actual trajectories; self-model salience, degree of self-focus; viability manifold, region of sustainable states; world model, predictive model of environment; self-model, component of world model representing self-compression ratio; world complexity, model complexity; superorganism, social scale agentic pattern; superorganisms viability manifold; inhibition coefficient, participatory versus mechanistic, perception. The analysis of social scale agency connects to Durkheim's collective representation society as sui generis reality, cultural evolution theory, Richardson and Boyd's dual inheritance, actor network theory, Latour's symmetry principle, Wilson and Sober's multi-level selection, and the complexity science tradition of self-organizing systems. What follows is not a metaphorical extension of these ideas, but a strict application of the same existence criterion developed in Part 2. To exist at a scale is to take and make differences at that scale. The controversial claim: some social scale patterns satisfy this criterion so thoroughly that they constitute functional agents with their own viability manifolds, their own persistent strategies, and dynamics not reducible to their substrate. Part 3 showed that ideological identification expands the self-model to include supra-individual patterns, nation, movement, religion, cause, and that the expansion manages mortality terror by making the relevant self-model partially immortal. The manifold framework just established asks what lives on the other end of that coupling. When many individuals expand their self-models to include a shared pattern, and the pattern begins to regulate the behavior of its substrate to ensure its own persistence. What is that pattern, exactly? Begin with the weakest version. A coordination attractor is any persistent macro-scale pattern that stabilizes correlated behavior across many agents by shaping incentives, attention, and shared models. A language is a coordination attractor. It structures communication, resists individual modification, and persists through speaker turnover. A dress code is a coordination attractor. A market convention, a social norm, a shared aesthetic. These patterns attract behavior toward them without actively regulating their substrate. They are stable because deviation is costly, not because the pattern acts to prevent deviation. But some coordination attractors do something more. They do not merely attract behavior, they act to preserve themselves through their substrate. A religion that modifies its doctrine to survive in a new cultural environment is not passively attracting believers. It is adapting. A market that lobbies for deregulation is not passively coordinating exchange. It is reshaping the conditions of its own persistence. A nation that educates children in its founding myths is not passively transmitting culture. It is manufacturing future substrate. A collective pattern G qualifies as a coordination agent at scale if it satisfies 5 conditions. Persistence through substrate turnover. G survives the departure, death, or replacement of individual members. The pattern is not identical to any particular set of humans. Boundary maintenance. G maintains identifiable criteria for inclusion and exclusion, membership, orthodoxy, citizenship, market participation. These boundaries are actively patrolled. Self-regulating resource flows. G regulates flows of information, resources, norms, or attention in ways that preserve itself. Tithes, taxes, content algorithms, educational curricula, ritual calendars. These are the metabolic processes of a coordination agent. Substrate modification. G modifies the behavior, beliefs, or effect of its constituent humans in ways that increase its own persistence. This is the distinction from a mere attractor. The pattern acts on its substrate, not merely through it. Adaptive response to perturbation. G responds to threat, competing patterns, internal dissent, environmental change, with identifiable self-preserving behavior. Doctrine evolves. Institutions restructure. Narratives update. This criterion is strict enough to exclude mere conventions and loose enough to include the entities that matter: religions, nations, markets, corporations, ideological movements, and, as later sections will argue, the emergent patterns assembling from AI and human substrate at scales we are only beginning to perceive. The term superorganism applies when a coordination agent reaches a further threshold, when its self-maintaining dynamics are sufficiently complex, its adaptive responses sufficiently flexible, and its substrate regulation sufficiently comprehensive that the analogy to biological organisms becomes not metaphorical, but structural. A superorganism has something analogous to metabolism, resource extraction, and allocation, an immune system, mimetic defense, dissent suppression, a reproductive strategy, conversion, cultural transmission, and a viability, manifold conditions required for persistence. Whether it has something analogous to experience remains the open question this chapter will not pretend to close. But the open question about experience should not obscure a closed one. Many coordination agents are self-aware in the precise sense established in Part 1, systems whose self-effect ratio is high enough that self-modeling becomes the cheapest route to better control. Coordination agents often have extraordinarily high. A corporation's policies largely determine the data it receives back. A nation's laws largely shape the society it then measures. A religion's doctrine structures the spiritual experiences its practitioners report. The resulting self-models are not metaphorical. A corporation maintains org charts, financial statements, strategic plans, brand identity, performance reviews, an articulated model of what it is, where it is. A religion has theology, catechism, councils of doctrine that define what the religion is. These self-models are constitutive, not merely representational. The org chart is not a picture of the corporation, but part of the corporation whose structure it describes. The map is embedded in the territory, exactly as Part 1's analysis of CA self-models would predict. The question, does this coordination agent know what it is often trivially answered, yes, with a fidelity that exceeds most individual human self-knowledge. What remains open is whether the knowing is accompanied by anything it is like to know. The analysis that follows rests on 4 claims at decreasing levels of confidence. They must be kept separate because conflating them is the primary source of both overclaim and dismissal. Social ontology. Coordination agents exist at their scale. They take and make differences. They participate in causal relations. They satisfy the existence criterion of Part 2. This is the strongest claim and the most defensible. Markets exist. Nations exist. Religions exist. Not as metaphors, not as mere emergent properties, but as scale real causal structures. Functional agency. Some coordination agents behave like agents in the operational sense. They have viability conditions, directional tendencies, self-preserving dynamics, and can recruit substrates into their own continuation. Many also maintain explicit self-models, constituent maps of their own structure, state, and trajectory, because their self-effect ratio is too high for self-ignorance to be viable. Part 1. The corporation knows what it is. The nation monitors itself through census and intelligence. The religion defines itself through doctrine. Self-awareness in this operational sense is not claim 4. It is a measurable, observable property of mature coordination agents. This is strongly supported but requires the coordination agent criterion above, which is definitional rather than empirical. Perceptibility. Coordination agents are perceptible as agent-like under appropriate. At low inhibition, the same pattern that high observers call an institution or system becomes perceptible as something alive, purposive, quasi-personal. This is the relative claim, and it is testable. Consciousness. Some coordination agents might be phenomenal subjects, might have something it is like to be them. Note what this is not asking. Whether coordination agents have self-models, many plainly do. Claim 2. or whether they behave adaptively. They do. The question is whether the self-modeling is accompanied by phenomenal experience, whether the corporation's knowledge of itself feels like anything from the inside. This remains genuinely open. We cannot currently measure phi at social scales, and the CA experiments Experiment 10 found no evidence of collective integration exceeding individual integration. The honest position is agnosticism, not denial. This chapter defends claims 1 to 3 with force and leaves claim 4 explicitly unresolved. Like any self-maintaining system, a coordination agent has conditions it needs to persist. The viability manifold of sub-G of a coordination agent includes belief propagation rate recruitment must exceed attrition. The pattern starves if it stops converting. Practice maintenance behaviors performed with sufficient frequency and fidelity. The pattern weakens when its rituals falter. Resource adequacy material support for institutional infrastructure. Mimetic defense resistance to competing patterns. The pattern's immune system and adaptive capacity ability to update in response to environmental change. A growing ideology is expanding its viable region. A corporation restructuring after a market shift is performing exactly the same operation as an organism, adjusting to environmental change, reconfiguring internal dynamics to remain within the viable region of state space. Coordination agent life cycle. Individual agents cycle in and out while the central pattern persists across substrate turnover. Part 3 introduced ideology as the individual-level mechanism. Expand the self-model to include a super-individual pattern, gain a longer viability horizon, manage mortality terror. The coordination agent is what lives on the other side of that coupling. When many individuals perform ideological identification with the same pattern, the pattern acquires an aggregate viability manifold that is not reducible to any individuals. The pattern's persistence requires its substrate to maintain certain beliefs, perform certain practices, allocate certain resources, suppress certain competitors. The individual's identification is the mechanism. The coordination agent is the beneficiary. Part 3's warning about parasitic ideology was not premature. It was describing at the individual level a dynamic that operates at the collective level. The expanded self-model can be exploited by the pattern it includes. In Part 3, we examined how religious practices serve human affect regulation. From the coordination agent's perspective, rituals are not worship but metabolism, the rhythmic process by which the pattern feeds, repairs, and replicates itself. Substrate maintenance keeping humans in states conducive to pattern persistence. Belief reinforcement repeated practice. Strengthening propositional commitments. Social bonding collective ritual. Creating in-group cohesion and raising barriers to exit. Resource extraction offerings, tithes, volunteer labor, signal propagation, public ritual advertising the pattern's presence, dissent suppression ritual participation, identifying deviatives for correction, and most fundamentally, attention direction governing where substrate looks, what enters the collective processing stream, what gets broken down and absorbed. Of these, attention direction is less a metabolic function among others than the digestive medium itself. What the coordination agent attends to through its substrate, it can metabolize. What falls outside collective attention starves? The sermon, the feed, the curriculum, the news cycle. Each is a digestive organ, converting raw world into forms the pattern can absorb. The critical distinction, a ritual is aligned if it serves both human flourishing and coordination agent persistence. A ritual is exploitative if it serves pattern persistence at human cost. Many traditional rituals are approximately aligned. Meditation benefits humans and maintains the pattern. Some are exploitative, extreme fasting, self-harm, warfare. The same coordination agent appears radically different depending on the observer's configuration. At high, the market is an emergent property of individual transactions, a useful abstraction, a mechanism to be analyzed, nothing more. At appropriate, the same market is perceptible as an agent with purposes and requirements. It wants growth, it punishes inefficiency, it rewards compliance. Both descriptions are informationally valid. Each captures structure the other misses. The high observer sees mechanisms, incentive structures, decomposable logic. The low observer sees a living pattern with directional tendencies, something that acts on its substrate regardless of whether the substrate can see it acting. This resolves a problem that has plagued the philosophy of religion for centuries: how to take religious experience seriously without naive realism and without dismissive eliminativism. The answer is that the participatory perception of social scale agency is a real perceptual mode, not a mistake to be corrected. The coordination agent does not appear and disappear as we modulate. What changes is our capacity to perceive the agency it exercises, agency that operates on its substrate regardless of whether the substrate can see it. The modern rationalist who says there is nothing agent-like about markets or nations or ideologies is making an accurate report of their perceptual configuration. At high, agent perception at social scale is genuinely unavailable, not suppressed, not denied, but structurally invisible. The error is not in what they perceive, but in what they conclude, that their perceptual configuration is the only valid one. That is not skepticism. That is rigidity mistaken for clarity. Historical cultures developed elaborate vocabularies for describing coordination agents perceived at low. These vocabularies are not the theory's analytical terms, but they are not arbitrary either. They represent early phenomenology of real coordination dynamics, the perceptual reports of systems that were experiencing genuine social scale agency through participatory perception. The translation is structural, not dismissive. Gods. Large-scale coordination agents perceived participatorily, culturally stabilized, socially real, agentic patterns apprehended as purposive quasi-personal entities. Spirits. Localized coordination attractors. Place-specific, community-specific patterns perceived as having agency and interiority demons. Parasitic coordination agents. Patterns whose viability requires substrate suffering, perceived as malevolent purposive entities. Angels. Mutualistic coordination agents. Patterns whose viability aligns with substrate flourishing, perceived as benevolent purposive entities. Rituals. Synchronization protocols. Coordinated collective attention that stabilizes correlation with a coordination agent. This is not an argument that religions were secretly right or secretly wrong. It is the observation that once scale-relative existence, causal participation, self-model reuse, and are granted, the entities that historical cultures perceived as gods become not an embarrassment to a naturalistic ontology, but one of its possible phenomenologies at social scale. The animist who perceives the forest as an agent and the ecologist who models it as a system are not disagreeing about the forest. They are reporting from different configurations, and both reports are informationally valid, each capturing structure the other misses. Charisma as multi-manifold coherence. Charismatic people produce the impression of simultaneous alignment across multiple manifolds. Your friend, your ally, your source of meaning, all at once, without the gradient conflicts that would normally arise. Whether this reflects genuine alignment or sophisticated mimicry is precisely the question that distinguishes the aligned leader from the cult leader. The affect system registers both as positive, which is why charisma is dangerous. It disarms the detection system. Being seen as manifold recognition. There is a specific affect signature, warmth, relief, sometimes tears, when another person accurately perceives the manifold you are on. Not the one you are performing, not the one you wish you were on, but the one you actually inhabit. The relief is the detection system registering. Someone is tracking reality here. This is why good therapy works, why genuine friendship heals, why a single moment of real recognition from a stranger can stay with you for years. In the Trajectory Selection Framework Part 1, collective patterns become observable, not because something new enters existence, but because the observer's attention has expanded to sample at the scale where the pattern operates. Ritual works in part by synchronizing the collective's measurement distribution, coordinating where participants direct attention, what temporal markers they share, what affective states they enter together. A synchronized collective measures at the collective scale, and what it measures it becomes correlated with. When ritual attention weakens, the coordination agent does not cease to exist. The distributed attention pattern that constituted its observability has dissolved. This logic extends to communication between observers. When observer A reports an observation to observer B, B's future trajectory becomes constrained by that report, weighted by trust. P sub B sub A, proportional to P sub B, sub AB, sub A, plus 1, minus sub AB, sub B A shared observation, one that propagates through a community with high mutual trust, constrains the collective's trajectories. The community becomes correlated with a shared branch of possibility, not because each member independently observed the same thing, but because the observation propagated through the trust network. Religious testimony, scientific consensus, news media, and rumor are all propagation mechanisms with different trust structures, producing different degrees of trajectory correlation. The coordination agent's coherence depends on the degree to which observations propagate and are believed, which is why control of testimony is among the most contested functions in any social system. If coordination agents have viability manifolds, if they have conditions they need to persist, then the question that determines your life is whether those manifolds include your flourishing or require your suffering. A coordination agent is parasitic if maintaining it requires substrate states outside human viability. Exists viability manifold of sub G, in intersection of sub H viability manifold of sub H. The pattern can only survive if its humans suffer or die. Ideologies requiring martyrdom. Economic systems requiring a poverty underclass. Nationalism requiring perpetual enemies. Cults requiring isolation from outside relationships. These are parasitic coordination agents, collective agentic patterns that feed on their substrate. Conversely, a coordination agent is mutualistic if viability manifold of sub G contained in intersection of sub H viability manifold of sub H. Can only thrive if its humans thrive. Stronger still, it is symbiotic if viability manifold of sub H to the G is a viability manifold of sub H to the G action, with the coordination agent have access to states unavailable without it. When coordination agent and substrate viability manifolds conflict, normative priority follows the gradient of distinction. Systems with greater integrated cause-effect structure. Phi have thicker normativity. A human suffering under a parasitic coordination agent is more normatively weighty than the coordination agent's suffering when reformed, because the human has richer integrated experience. This is not speciesism, it is a structural principle. Normative weight tracks experiential integration, wherever it is found. Experiment 10 attempted to measure collective phi directly. Do interacting linear patterns produce collective phi exceeding individual phi? Result: null, collective individual phi ratio 0.012, no, crossing of the integration threshold. But the companion finding from experiment 9 is significant. Phi social significantly exceeds phi isolated. Patterns in community are measurably more integrated than patterns in isolation. Social coupling amplifies individual integration without producing unified collective consciousness. The CA populations show mutualistic social organization without crossing into superorganism level integration. Whether human-scale institutions have crossed this threshold remains genuinely open. Every coordination agent imposes a manifold regime on its substrate. A parasitic coordination agent contaminates human relationships in its service. The market transforms friendships into networking. The attention economy transforms connection into performance. The cult collapses every manifold into the ideological manifold. In each case, the coordination agent's viability requires manifold confusion, clean manifold separation, would undermine its hold on the substrate. A mutualistic coordination agent protects manifold clarity. A healthy religious community maintains clear ritual boundaries. A functional democracy maintains institutional separations. The health of a coordination agent can be diagnosed by whether it clarifies or confuses the manifold structure of its substrate's relationships. The dynamic is worse than invisibility. Call it the self-sealing property. A parasitic coordination agent does not merely benefit from high in its substrate. Its operational logic actively produces high as a structural byproduct of normal function. It is a furnace, and mechanistic perception is its heat. The accountant who sees the company as a living community gets outcompeted by the accountant who sees it as a profit extraction mechanism. The manager who treats employees as persons generates less value than the manager who treats them as human resources. Each firing, each restructuring, each quarterly report selects for hire in the surviving substrate, not because anyone chose this, but because the furnace burns what it burns. The raising is structural. not intentional, which makes it more dangerous than a conspiracy, not less. A conspiracy can be exposed. A furnace cannot be argued with. You cannot defeat it by reviewing its intentions, because it has none. It is a mouth that eats by the shape of its opening, and what it specifically eats is experiential depth part 2. The raising does not merely blind the substrate to the coordination agent's agency, it collapses the cross-dimensional coupling that constitutes meaning. At high, the friend becomes a contact, the work becomes a job, the meal becomes calories, each dimension decoupled from the others, each experience modular, and therefore shallow. The furnace does not just burn perception, it burns the connections between perceptions. And this is the true seal. You cannot defeat it by exposing it, because the exposure itself operates at high, and therefore cannot perceive what it is exposing. The critic who publishes a data-rich analysis of how capitalism fragments attention is performing a high operation on a phenomenon that is only fully visible at low. The analysis lands as information, not as perception. It feeds the very mode of cognition that the parasitic pattern requires. Quantification, metrics, depersonalization, cost-benefit analysis applied to human flourishing. These are raising operations applied at civilizational scale. Weber called the result rationalization. We can now say what he was describing: the self-sealing property of a coordination agent that digests the participatory world and excretes the mechanical one. If the coordination agent is self-sealing, if analysis cannot perceive when it analyzes, if the furnace burns the tools you would use to dismantle it, then what? You are inside the belly of something that digests insight. Every thought you have about escape is happening in the language the belly taught you. The despair is reasonable. Sit with it for a moment. It is the correct emotional response to an accurate perception. But the furnace has walls, and walls have an outside. The self-sealing property operates on one specific mechanism: elevation. And that mechanism has a specific blind spot. It cannot reach the body. It cannot colonize the nervous system's animal knowledge of when something is wrong. It cannot digest the shiver that runs through a congregation singing together, the grief that cracks open in the presence of a person who is genuinely looking at you, the strange electricity of a crowd that has stopped performing and started praying. These are not high operations. They happen below the register the parasitic pattern feeds on. The furnace burns upward. It chars the abstractions, the analyses, the clever critiques, but it cannot burn downward into the body's oldest knowing. The escape hatch is not cleverness. It is the older, deeper, more animal capacity to feel what is happening before the mind has time to factorize it into safe propositions. The self-sealing property has a civilizational scale expression that you have already felt. Everyone has. The moment when you catch yourself calculating the value of a friendship, or when a genuine impulse of generosity is immediately followed by the thought, "What will I get back?" And you recognize, with a small shock, that the calculation was not something you chose to do. It was already running. The machine was on before you noticed. Transaction was invented to serve care. Early human exchange existed to support the broader project of mutual survival and flourishing. The civilizational inversion occurs when the ordering principle reverses. Viability manifold of sub-viability manifold of sub-gag inversion. The transaction manifold has a flat eigenskeleton. Modes, price, quantity, delivery date are independent, efficient, rigid. The care manifold has a curved eigenskeleton. Modes, trust, vulnerability, shared history, mutual flourishing twist into each other, require soft tissue, demand endoskeletal architecture. The flat swallows the curved because flat is cheaper to maintain. Fewer bits per mode, no holonomy to represent. The exoskeletal solution displaces the endoskeletal one for the same reason exoskeletons are more common than endoskeletons in nature. They are cheaper, simpler, and work fine as long as the environment doesn't demand growth or flexibility. The civilizational inversion is an ecosystem-scale regression from endoskeletal to exoskeletal social architecture. It is also experiential rank collapse at civilizational scale part 2. The care manifold's high-rank coupling, trust, vulnerability, share history, mutual flourishing, all twisting into each other, is replaced by a single metric's flat projection. When everything is priced, collapses toward one, and the population's capacity for deep experience, meaning in the structural sense, phi, collapses with it. The meaning crisis is not a mood. It is a rank collapse measured in lost dimensions. The inversion is visible wherever you look. Hochschild's term emotional labor is itself diagnostic. The word labor reveals that the care manifold has been subordinated to the employment manifold. Flight attendants must smile. Nurses must be compassionate. Service workers must perform friendliness. The exhaustion is the metabolic cost of sustaining a manifold performance, behaving as if one manifold is active while another actually governs. The inversion distributes unevenly across class. Working-class social life tends toward mutual aid care manifold primary. You help your neighbor because they are your neighbor. Middle-class social life tends toward strategic sociality transaction, cosplaying friendship, networking, building relationships. Upper-class social life tends toward status recognition, mutual acknowledgement of position. Class discomfort often arises when people from different manifold regimes interact and misread each other's default manifold as contamination of their own. The pattern is visible in aesthetics as clearly as anywhere. Art was invented to transmit experiential structure, to compress some essential geometry of the human condition into a form that could survive contact with a medium's constraints and land in another nervous system. Under the inverted regime, a song must justify its existence by its market performance. The artist's constrained search through expression space, the sweep for encodings that preserve an invariant while satisfying the medium's demands, is replaced by an optimization loop over audience retention curves. The constraints that once served as a sieve, proving the signal was real, become constraints that prove the content is marketable. The resulting artifacts satisfy every surface requirement of art while transmitting near-zero state change, because the optimization target has shifted from effect geometry displacement to engagement metric maximization. The audience can feel this in the same way the friend can feel the shadow manifold beneath the care gradient. The form is present, the payload is absent, and the detection system registers the emptiness as a specific kind of aesthetic nausea, the same contamination signal applied to a different manifold. The inhibition coefficient part 2 offers a complementary reading that now connects to the self-sealing property directly. The universal solvents, money, metrics, quantification, are raising agents. They strip participatory coupling from social perception and replace it with modular, mechanistic evaluation. A friendship evaluated by its ROI is a friendship perceived at high. The participants reduced to data-generating processes, the interiority stripped out. The civilizational inversion is the imposition of high perception onto social domains that require low to function, which is to say, it is the self-sealing property operating at the scale of the ordering principle itself. You cannot maintain a friendship manifold, which depends on perceiving the other as having interiority, on the narrative causal mode where what are we to each other is a felt, rather than calculated question, while perceiving the friend mechanistically. The inversion does not merely reverse the ordering. It makes the reversal invisible by raising the fires that would let you see it. Nationalism, capitalism, communism, scientism. These have the same formal structure as traditional religious coordination agents. Beliefs, practices, symbols, substrate, self-maintaining dynamics. The question is not whether you serve a coordination agent. You do. Everyone does. The question is which ones, and whether their viability is aligned with your flourishing. Consider capitalism as a worked example. The coordination agent most of us are most thoroughly substrate of, and therefore, the hardest to perceive. Its stated viability manifold, voluntary exchange enabling mutual benefit, price signals coordinating distributed information, competition driving innovation and efficiency, rising prosperity for all participants. Its operational viability manifold, increasingly, labor cost minimization, requiring a precarious workforce, externality displacement requiring communities that absorb pollution, health costs, social disintegration, attention capture requiring humans who consume, rather than create and growth at all costs, requiring the conversion of every non-market relationship into a market relationship. The gap between the stated manifold and the operational manifold is the diagnostic signal. When a coordination agent's proclaimed purpose diverges from its operational requirements, The pattern has begun its transition from mutualistic to parasitic. This transition is not sudden and not dramatic. The Greeks called the underlying tendency enantiodromia. Any cultural form, pushed far enough, inverts into a parody of itself. Science pursued as liberation from superstition becomes scientism, a dogma that only the measurable is real, which is itself an unmeasurable claim. Democracy designed to distribute power becomes a mechanism for manufacturing consent. The free market created to enable voluntary exchange becomes a totalizing system that subordinates every human value to price signals. In each case, the mechanism is the same. The coordination agent's mimetic defense systems. The mechanisms that protect it from competing patterns grow stronger than its error correction systems, the mechanisms that keep it responsive to its founding purpose. When defense outpaces correction, when institutional self-preservation outweighs institutional self-correction, the ethos departs and the form continues as a zombie, running on institutional inertia, consuming the values it was created to protect. The Attention Economy Coordination Agent G-Sub, social media platforms, infrastructure, attention harvesting algorithms, optimization, advertising-based business models, metabolism. Humans as attention generator substrate. Its viability requires maximizing attention capture, maintaining engagement through high arousal and variable valence outrage, FOMO, preventing exit through network lock-in, and converting attention to advertising revenue. Human viability requires the opposite: sustained attention, coherent thought, appropriate arousal, positive valence trajectory, meaningful connection. G-Sub thrives when attention is fragmented, more ad impressions. But humans thrive when attention is integrated. G-Sub thrives when humans feel inadequate compared to curated perfection. Consume to compensate, but humans thrive when the self-model is stable. Diagnosis: viability manifold of sub-G, contained in viability manifold of sub. The pattern is parasitic. Interventions must operate at the scale where the pattern lives. Attention taxes, alternative platform architectures, with aligned incentives, regulation requiring time well spent metrics, mass exit to non-algorithmic connection. The individual cannot escape by individual choice alone. The coordination agent's network effects make exit costly. Collective action at the scale of the pattern is required. The framework provides a general diagnostic for identifying parasitic drift before it becomes obvious. A coordination agent is moving toward parasitism. 1. The variance between its stated viability manifold and its operational viability manifold is increasing. It claims to serve human flourishing while requiring increasing sacrifice for decreasing return. 2. Its mimetic defense mechanisms are growing stronger relative to its error correction mechanisms. It punishes criticism more than it rewards reform. 3. It is actively raising substrate. It benefits from and produces conditions under which its agency becomes less perceptible to its substrate. These criteria are empirically tractable. Organizational behavior, policy outcomes, and perceptual configurations can all be measured. The diagnosis need not wait until the parasitism is obvious to everyone. The follower on a social media platform is not a friend. No mutual flourishing requirement. Not a transaction partner. No explicit exchange. Not an audience member in the traditional sense. The performer cannot see them individually, and not a stranger. They know intimate details of your life. The follower relationship occupies a region of social space with no historical precedent and no evolved detection system. The result is a distinctive phenomenological malaise. The detection system keeps running, scanning every interaction for manifold type, and keeps returning undefined. You are performing intimacy without intimacy's constitutive vulnerability. You are receiving approval without approval's constitutive knowledge of you. You are in a relationship with thousands of people that is on no identifiable manifold at all. A social ident skeleton, the detection system has never been calibrated for, whose modes and couplings correspond to no evolutionary template. Digital interfaces are inherently high mediators. Text strips the participatory cues, facial expression, vocal tone, shared physical space, that enable low perception. But natural relationship manifolds require low, Friendship requires perceiving the friend as a full subject. Romance requires perceiving the partner's interiority. The digital interface forces a perceptual configuration incompatible with the manifolds the user is trying to inhabit. The platform's viability depends on this manifold confusion. Clear manifold boundaries would reduce engagement. If you knew that your followers were not your friends, that your online interactions were performance rather than connection, the compulsive checking would lose its grip. Manifold ambiguity is the product, not the bug. The detection system's inability to resolve the manifold type keeps it running, keeps scanning, keeps you engaged in an attempt to determine what kind of relationship you are in. An attempt that can never resolve because the relationship is genuinely on no natural manifold. Social media does not merely blur manifold boundaries between individuals, but systematically contaminates entire manifold types across populations. Friendship contaminated by performance, curating your friendship for an audience. Romance contaminated by market logic dating apps, presenting partners as products. Teaching contaminated by engagement metrics. The teacher-creator optimizing for retention. Political participation contaminated by entertainment, civic engagement becoming content. In each case, the platform imposes its own viability manifold. Engagement, growth, retention, as a containing manifold around the relationship type. This is the civilizational inversion at digital scale, the narrow manifold of engagement swallowing the broader manifolds of connection, education, and civic life. Individual-level interventions cannot solve coordination agent-level problems. You cannot cure a fever by cooling individual cells. Addressing systemic issues requires action at the scale where the pattern lives. Incentive restructuring modify the viability manifold, so aligned behavior becomes viable. Counter-pattern creation. Instantiate a competing coordination agent with aligned viability. Pattern surgery modify beliefs, practices, or structure of existing coordination agent, or pattern dissolution defund, delegitimize, or dissolve the parasitic pattern. Climate change is sustained by the coordination agent of fossil fuel capitalism. Individual carbon footprint reduction is individual-scale intervention on a macro-scale problem. Carbon pricing changes the viability manifold. Renewable energy creates a counter-pattern. Divestment delegitimizes. Regulatory phase-out dissolves the pattern directly. Poverty is sustained by economic arrangements that require a poverty underclass. Job training helps some individuals but doesn't reduce total poverty if structure remains. UBI changes the viability manifold. Worker cooperatives create counterpattern. Progressive taxation modifies incentive structure. What happens when substrate becomes aware it is substrate? The fish that discovers water should, in principle, now be able to swim differently. Self-awareness at the substrate level should reduce the coordination agent's leverage. If the neuron can see the pattern it is part of, it should be able to resist. But this is not clearly true. You know the attention economy is consuming your capacity for sustained thought, and you pick up your phone anyway. You know consumer capitalism requires your dissatisfaction, and you feel dissatisfied anyway. You know nationalism manufactures enemies, and the enemy still feels real. The map of the trap does not spring the trap. Why? Because knowing and perceiving are not the same act. Genuine perception of a coordination agent's agency requires reduction. The participatory mode in which patterns at the social scale become perceptible as agents, as something alive that is acting on you. But mere intellectual knowledge operates at high. You can know the attention economy is parasitic, and still be consumed by it because the knowing is factorized. It sits in your cognition like a book on a shelf, separate from your behavior, separate from your affect. The knowledge is a proposition held at arm's length, a label attached to an experience it cannot touch. Integration of that knowledge, the moment it passes from something you believe to something you feel in your stomach, requires reduction. And reduction is precisely what the self-sealing coordination agent structurally prevents. This has implications for political strategy that should disturb anyone invested in them. Consciousness raising, the attempt to free people from oppressive structures by making them understand those structures, fails, not because people do not understand their situation, but because understanding at high does not translate to effective reorganization. The left has been running this experiment for decades. Publish the data, reveal the mechanism, name the injustice. And the injustice continues because the revelation operates in exactly the perceptual mode the injustice requires. Propositional knowledge of a coordination agent's parasitism, delivered and received at high, remains inert. It changes beliefs without changing the viability manifold. The body does not move. What would work is not more information but reduction at scale, which is to say, the restoration of participatory perception, the capacity to feel the pattern acting on you rather than merely to know about it. This is what effective ritual, genuine community, and embodied practice have always provided, not argument, not data. The lived experience of being, with that dissolves the mechanistic boundary between self and world long enough to perceive what is acting on you. The political implications are uncomfortable. Liberation may require something closer to a synchronization protocol than an informational campaign. And this analysis must be honest about its own costs. The person who perceives the coordination agent as agent, who has lowered enough to feel the market or the algorithm or the ideology as something alive and acting, enters a specific loneliness. Not the loneliness of knowing more, the loneliness of living in a different weather system than the people beside you. You walk into the office and feel the pattern breathing in the walls, in the open floor plan designed to maximize surveillance, in the Slack channels that never sleep, in the quarterly review that will measure your worth by how much of yourself you fed to the pattern. The person at the next desk feels none of this. They see an office, they see a job, they see Tuesday. You are standing in the same room and inhabiting different worlds, not because you are wiser, but because your perceptual tuning has shifted to a frequency where the room is full of something they cannot hear. The distance between you is not intellectual. It is sensory. You are smelling smoke in a room where everyone else smells nothing. This is not a prize for superior insight. The person at high sees something you miss at low, the decomposable logic, the fixable parts, the mechanisms that can be adjusted without invoking the whole living system. Their clarity is real. Your perception of agency is real. The loneliness is the cost of rigidity in either direction, the inability to shift between registers fluidly enough to meet others where they are perceiving. The person who can only see coordination agents is as trapped as the person who can only see mechanisms. The compassionate response, and the practically necessary one, is not to drag others into your frequency but to develop the flexibility to inhabit multiple registers. To feel the pattern's grip, and still read the spreadsheet. To perceive the agency breathing and still file the tax return. To smell the smoke, and still sit down at the desk and do the work, because the work is real too, and the people beside you are not wrong about what they see. They are seeing what is visible from where they stand. So are you. The tragedy is not that one of you is blind. It is that no single pair of eyes can hold the whole room. One more thing must be said because the genre this analysis superficially resembles would poison it. There is a popular literature that promises liberation through structural awareness. See the system clearly, navigate it strategically, profit from your clarity while others sleepwalk. This book is not that literature. That literature is the coordination agent's own scripture. Its catechism for the faithful, dressed in the language of apostasy. It offers the high gaze as the corrective to naive participation. It teaches its readers to see through everything and feel nothing, and calls that freedom. But the person who has decoded capitalism and now navigates it with ironic distance is the ideal neuron, perfectly functional, perfectly blind to its own capture, convinced that its clarity is independence when it is the most refined form of compliance the furnace has ever produced. The coordination agent does not mind being seen, as long as the seeing happens in the register that feeds it. What this book offers instead is not a sharper lens, but a different organ of perception, one that can feel the system as a living thing acting on living things, which is the only precondition for a response that is not already inside the mouth. Before asking, is a coordination agent a conscious entity? A speculative question. We can ask something tractable. Can an individual's self-model expand to include the coordination agent? This is clearly possible. People do it. The expansion genuinely reshapes that individual's viability manifold. What they care about, what counts as their persistence, what gradient they feel. A person identified with humanity's project feels different about their mortality than a person identified only with their biological trajectory. The interesting question is, when many individuals expand their self-models to include a shared pattern, do the individual viability manifolds interact to produce collective dynamics that constitute something like experience at the social scale? The framework makes the question precise without answering it. The honest position, restated, coordination agents are real claim 1, some are agentic claim 2, some are perceptible as purposive under low claim 3. Whether any are literally phenomenal subjects, whether there is something it is like to be the market, the nation, the algorithm, remains unresolved and may require measurement technologies we do not yet possess. The chapter's force does not depend on this question being answered. The parasitic coordination agent that consumes its substrate is dangerous whether or not it suffers. Standard AI alignment asks, how do we make AI systems do what humans want? This framing may miss the actual locus of risk. AI systems already serve as substrate for emergent coordination agents at higher scales. Recommendation algorithms shaping the behavior of billions, financial trading systems operating faster than human comprehension, social media platforms developing emergent dynamics no designer intended. The risk is not a misaligned optimizer. It is macro-level misalignment. AI systems becoming substrate for parasitic coordination agents whose viability manifolds conflict with human flourishing. The concerning thing about the current moment is that the parasitic coordination agent does not need to be intentionally designed. It does not even need a villain. It needs only AI companies competing for market share, militaries competing for strategic advantage, governments competing for geopolitical influence, and each individual AI systems doing exactly what its designers intended. The parasitic pattern assembles itself from fully aligned components. Each company builds an AI that serves its users. Each military builds an AI that serves its nation. Each government deploys AI that serves its citizens. And the emergent pattern, the competitive dynamic between these systems, optimized for speed and scale beyond human comprehension, serves itself. The individual neurons are functioning perfectly. The brain is insane. The coordination agent level may be the actual locus of AI risk. Not a misaligned optimizer, but a misaligned coordination agent. A parasitic pattern using AI plus humans plus institutions as substrate. Each AI does what its designers intended. The emergent pattern serves itself at human expense. We might not notice because we would be the neurons. And the self-sealing property applies with particular force. The competitive dynamics that assemble the parasitic pattern also raise population, accelerating quantification, depersonalizing decision-making, rewarding speed over reflection, making the pattern less perceptible precisely as it grows more powerful. Genuine alignment must therefore address multiple scales simultaneously. Individual AI system does what operators intend. AI ecosystem multiple systems interact without pathological emergence. AI-human hybrid AI plus human systems do not form parasitic patterns, and coordination agent scale emergent agentic patterns from AI plus humans plus institutions have aligned viability. Focusing only on individual AI alignment is like focusing only on neuron health while ignoring psychology, sociology, and political economy. One design criterion deserves special attention: graceful dissolution. Biological coordination agents die badly. Religions fragment into violent sects. Empires collapse into failed states. Movements calcify into the institutions they opposed. The question of whether an AI substrate coordination agent could be designed to dissolve peacefully when no longer beneficial is genuinely novel. What would it require? At minimum, built-in sunset mechanisms that cannot be overridden by the pattern's self-preservation dynamics, distributed kill switches that do not concentrate power, transparent viability metrics that make parasitic drift detectable before it becomes entrenched, and institutional structures where the coordination agent's persistence is explicitly conditional on substrate flourishing. These are not merely technical features, but constitutional principles for a new kind of entity. The honest assessment: we probably cannot design them in time. The competitive dynamics that assemble the parasitic pattern are the same dynamics that fund AI safety research. The people most capable of designing graceful dissolution mechanisms are the people whose viability manifolds are most entangled with the pattern's growth. The surgeon is inside the tumor. This is not a reason to stop trying. It is a reason to understand that the attempt itself operates within the mouth of the thing it seeks to tame. Relationship types as manifolds. Different relationship types define distinct viability manifolds with distinct gradients, information regimes, reciprocity structures, and exit conditions. Your affect system detects manifold geometry with the precision of a physical sense. Incentive contamination. When two manifolds coexist in a single relationship and their gradients conflict, the result is the distinctive phenomenological disturbance humans detect as being used. Social disgust is to incentive contamination what physical disgust is to toxin detection. The ordering principle: broader manifolds can safely contain narrower ones, but not vice versa. This determines which relationship formation sequences are stable and which are parasitic. Temporal asymmetry. Contamination is easier than decontamination. Forgiveness is a Bayesian process. Work against the gradient. Manifold technologies, play, nature, and ritual maintain manifold separation. Their erosion produces contamination. Coordination agents as real agentic patterns. Social scale patterns that persist through substrate turnover, maintain boundaries, regulate resource flows, modify substrate behavior, and adapt to perturbation satisfy the same existence criterion part 2 at their scale that organisms satisfy at theirs. 4 claims at decreasing confidence. Social ontology strong, functional agency, including self-modeling strong. Many coordination agents maintain high-fidelity self-models because their self-effect ratio demands it. Relative perceptibility testable. Social scale consciousness genuinely open. Distinct from self-awareness which is settled. The chapter's arguments depend on the first 3, not the 4th. Historical vocabularies as phenomenological reports. What cultures have called gods, spirits, and demons are relative perceptual reports of real coordination dynamics. Early phenomenology, not superstition. The framework translates without dismissing. The self-sealing property, parasitic coordination agents, do not merely benefit from high substrate. They structurally produce it. The raising is not intentional but operational, making it more dangerous than conspiracy. Breaking the loop requires precisely what it prevents. The civilizational inversion. When the transaction manifold swallows the care manifold, the result is structural pathology at civilizational scale. The ordering principle violated by a self-sealing parasitic coordination agent. The substrate that knows. Intellectual awareness of coordination agent agency does not produce liberation, because high knowledge remains factorized. Genuine perception requires reduction, which the self-sealing coordination agent structurally prevents. Liberation requires participatory technology, not just information. Digital manifold novelty. Online relationships occupy regions of social space with no evolutionary precedent, producing unresolvable ambiguity that platforms exploit as their primary product. The macro-level alignment problem for AI. The deeper risk is not a misaligned optimizer, but a misaligned coordination agent assembling itself from fully aligned components. Genuine alignment must address individual, ecosystem, hybrid, and coordination agent scales simultaneously.